Chapter 101, The Ancient Book and the Relic Part 2. What does that mean? Roland wondered while stroking that line of the sentence. Has the author of the ancient book fought against the monsters on barbarian land? As he continued to read, more information came into sight. The number of demons increased while ours decreased. Even God's stones of retaliation failed to stop them. These enemies were so ferocious and frightening that they could easily quash our resistance just with their monstrous, unparalleled physical strength. They didn't even need to summon their magic power. Holy city of Tequila had fallen, and we scattered to run for our lives. Across mountains and rivers, we strove to stay as far away from the gates of hell as possible. But where can we take our refuge next time? Nonetheless, I don't need to worry about this problem anymore. I'm dying, Natalia. Demon's power is destroying my health. My illness is now beyond any medical treatment. I write these in hopes that you can help me with something. Alice's experiment of God's punishment army is almost completed. It was a great success. These extraordinary warriors are capable of competing against demons. However, she has forgotten that even if the God's punishment army wins the battle, the victory won't be ours. That's right. God's punishment army will bring us nothing but devastation. Go stop her, for this is something only you can achieve. It was not a long paragraph. After skimming it through, Roland sank into thoughts and tried to put himself in Kara's shoes. Suppose Kara did not know the existence of demons and replaced the word demons with witches in this paragraph. She would easily make the assumption that the church's army was defeated by witches. Combining this assumption with the afloat rumors that witches were demons' accomplices, whose magic power came from the gates of hell, Kara would readily jump to the conclusion that the church endeavored to cover up the fact that the gates of hell was the entrance of Holy Mountain. For hundreds of years, witches had been looking for their holy mountain for an eternal life. That was why the number of witches increased while the church's army decreased. Of course, there were quite a few points in this speculation that did not sound plausible. For example, the monstrous, unparalleled physical strength was definitely not a faculty possessed by witches. Another peculiar theory was that witches crushed the church's army despite the influences of God's stones of retaliation. Roland did not know what exactly made Kara resolve to come to barbarian land. Had her fervent eagerness to find Holy Mountain clouded her judgment? Or, rather, the real reason behind her decision was actually hidden in the part Scroll had missed? Roland preferred the latter conjecture. At least he now knew that the last page of the book was talking about demons, a real foreign race, rather than witches. But it did not answer his questions. Instead, it created more. When had the church had a battle with demons? Roland rummaged the memory of fourth princes, but could not find anything. The church had established its general headquarters in the north after the Battle of Faiths, for the purpose of preventing demonic beasts from invading the inner land from the ravine. Later, they had built a magnificent stronghold city on the plateau of Hermes and had named it New Holy City. The two connected cities, one high and the other low, were both used to defend against demonic beasts instead of demons. As to the name Tequila, Roland had never heard of it. If such stories were true, the church had no reason to keep them from the public. In the church's history books, every major battle the church had won were recorded in great details. The church people would elaborate on each victory they had gained to manifest their glorious achievements. It seemed strange, however, that they failed to mention anything about the battle against demons, for such a fight was absolutely more intense and worthy to be advertised than the ones with demonic beasts or witches. The last question was in regard to the God's punishment army. Evidently, this church member who wrote the book did not wish to build such an army. So, he asked somebody else to stop the experiment that appeared to be successful. Roland only knew the church had the Judgment Army but had never heard of the God's Punishment Army. Of course, there was also a big chance that the former Prince Roland was too ignorant and had not been provided with such information. Roland did not understand why the writer thought the God's Punishment Army would bring destruction. From its description, the army seemed to be as powerful as demons. If this was the case, it could but greatly benefit the church. These two arguments were probably what Scroll felt inconceivable. Do you know where Kara got this misleading ancient book? Roland looked up and glanced at Nightingale. By the time I joined them, they had been looking for Holy Mountain already. Nightingale muttered with a mouthful of dried fish between her teeth. But Wendy once told me the Witch Cooperation Association was initially not an association at all. It was just a small group of a few witches who happened to gather at Winshire, among whom were Kara, Wendy, and Scroll. They later found a secret meeting spot in the eastern forest not far away from Winshire, which, unexpectedly, appeared to be the entrance to an underground relic. She swallowed the snack and licked her lips. But only Kara went down there. Was the ancient book found in the relic? Well, that's what Kara claimed. Nightingale twitched her mouth. After that, more witches joined the group. Someone might accidentally expose their traces during a meeting. So, one day, the church sent a great number of Judgment Army and surrounded the forest. During that raid, more than a dozen witches were killed. It was at that time that Kara made up her mind to go to the impassable mountain range and seek Holy Mountain. From then on, they started to call the group the Witch Cooperation Association and regard the search for Holy Mountain as its members' ultimate goal. Roland was absorbed in thoughts after hearing the account. His knowledge of mythology was so limited that anything related to histories or folklores just escaped his mind. The ancient book did not specify the year, so he had no idea whether other history books recorded such a battle. As the soldiers in that battle had all passed away, Roland thought the only way to figure out what had happened was to explore the relic in person. Nonetheless, Roland knew it was impossible. The eastern forest was too far. His current priority was to develop his territory rather than travel across the whole kingdom of Greycastle on a whim. Roland paced to the window and looked at the garden down there through the French window. The witches were training themselves as he had instructed. Now, he had 12 witches in total working for him, and it was time to formally establish an organization. He did not plan to set up any guidelines or regulations for the organization, for the organization was essentially founded for an easy management and to help the witches develop their abilities. It would be similar to the industrial unionism in the modern world. There were only two simple rules for the organization, which were, A. the prohibition of using abilities to violate laws, and B. the prohibition of using abilities to evade legal liabilities. Roland was initially thinking about following the example of the 3 laws of robotics and formulating some rules to forbid a witch to injure or cause harms to an ordinary person by using her power. But he soon realized it was rather unnecessary. Power to a witch was like a gun to a human being. There was essentially no difference between using a gun and using abilities, for both were self-defense. Besides, an overemphasis on the difference between witches and ordinary people would only widen the gap between the two groups. Therefore, no breach of laws and no evasion of liabilities were the most concise terms a dull engineer could think of. As for the name of the organization, Roland had had an idea long before. This brand new organization would be called the Witch Union. Chapter 102, The Honeysuckles and the Elks Part 1. When night approached, the Earl Elk's mansion was brightened up by glitters of lights. After Petrov handed in his invitation card, he was led by a servant to the hall. The Earl's third daughter, Aurelia's birthday party had just started. The guests invited to this party were invariably nobles from prominent families in Longsong's stronghold. From the woolen carpet in the hall and the servants' gilded black uniforms, one could tell the Earl took the matter very seriously. After all, it was Aurelia's 16th birthday. She had reached an age of maturity and was ready to be introduced into society for a decent marriage. The music rang while the servants passed through the crowd with wines and glasses in their hands. Steamy food was placed on the several round tables in the hall. Aurelia, on the other hand, like a proud canary in full bloom, enthroned herself among a group of ladies at the corner, appearing to be in good humor. Unlike the banquet in the western region, where everybody sat around the long wooden table, waiting for chefs to serve food which was usually a big bowl of pork, a whole chicken, buttered bread, some golden fried eggs and lettuce. The party here was all about style and fashion. Having said that, it was still incomparable to a true first-class banquet. To Petrov, who had lived in the King City for several years and knew the real extravagance, the birthday party was merely a superficial imitation. For instance, the wine glasses delivered by the servants were in various colors rather than pure, transparent ones. Because of this, the glasses could neither display the vivid color of the grape wine nor enhance its mellow taste. The table should be entirely covered with white draperies to conceal the grease underneath. Meanwhile, the food, which still stuck to the typical Western region tradition, was served in large portions and chopped into big pieces. Petrov shook his head. At least, the chef should slice them before serving. It was a common practice for nobles to eat before the banquet so that they would not need to bother cutting these big chunks of meat on their own. Since every guest at the party represented his own family, it was considered as very impertinent to devour like a savage. Petrov did not want to become a conversation piece of those ladies. "Hey, man, long time no see." Someone suddenly flung his arm around his neck. "I've heard you were appointed as the ambassador by the Lord again? How's the mining business in Border Town going? I bet you've reaped a big profit from it, haven't you?" By the familiar voice, Petrov soon recognized the person as Roland, the second son of the Elk family, a complete idiot who had been longing to become a knight yet was not even capable of managing his own territory. In spite of this, he was still a friend of his. Not bad. Reluctant to talk about his experience in Border Town, Petrov simply steered away from the subject. "Did you put your combating skills to good use at Coldwind Ridge this time? Or you just locked yourself in a tavern at Hermes shaking like a leaf? Damn it." Rene pushed Petrov in his back, complaining. "You just won't stop criticizing me, will you? I didn't even go to New Holy City this time because I happened to have caught a cold on the very first day the troops set out. So, I lay in bed for a whole week." "Good. You did better than last time. At least, you saved the troops a lot of trouble." "You're wrong though." Rene suddenly summoned up a mysterious smile. "If I didn't happen to stay in bed at Coldwind Ridge for a week, I would probably stay at the freezing city wall of Holy City forever." "What do you mean?" Petrov raised his eyebrows. "I got the news from someone else." The second son of the Elks whispered in Petrov's ear. "New Holy City almost fell. Demonic beasts dashed into the inner city and nearly took the cathedral. Fortunately, the church sent out their strongest warriors and stopped them. The armies of the Four Kingdoms, however, suffered great losses. Only very few people returned to Coldwind Ridge from the battle. It made tons of women in the city into widows within just a month. Those who don't have savings." Rene winked and made a gesture. 2 silver royals for a night. "Hey, don't look at me like this. I didn't do anything." "Are you sure it's true? What about the border guards?" "I saw it with my own eyes. The Lord was shocked and got sick on the very day he received the news." Rene shrugged. "As to the troops, there's nothing he can do about it but slowly recruiting more in the future. Experienced soldiers are currently in urgent need in the northern region. I would have been able to command a group of knights if my family didn't desire my immediate return." "This isn't the point," Petrov said within himself. The main purpose to garrison a troop at the border of Coldwind Ridge was to defend against the Judgment Army from the church. Now, soldiers of the Four Kingdoms died in Hermes altogether. Petrov somehow smelled conspiracies. If the church was indeed scheming something, the north of Grey Castle was currently as vulnerable and defenseless as a stripped, helpless woman. What about the casualties among the Judgment Army? Won't be better than troops of the Four Kingdoms. It's pretty obvious because they're all crazy men who always rush at the very front. In fact, nobody will voluntarily fight until the Judgment Army takes the first move," Rene said scornfully. "Those knights are always talking about their chivalrous manners. But when it comes to a real battle against demonic beasts, they're the last to put their words into action. There's one such kind of fellow right in front of me." Petrov smiled. Perhaps he had just been paranoid. Even if the church did plot to invade the north, it had nothing to do with Long Song's stronghold. It was something the new king should worry about. Unfortunately, nobody wants to employ me, or rather, I haven't found anyone I want to pledge alliance to. Renee paused for a moment and looked toward the door. I saw the Wolf family coming in. I've got to greet them. Talk to you later. Sure. You don't need to worry about me. Right. Just when Renee was about to walk off, he turned around again. Have you noticed the handkerchief tugged in the invitation card? You put in there? No, I'll only put my old socks. Renee waved his finger. My sister made the handkerchief herself. Although you're a lot older than her, I'll fully support you if you have the intention to seek this union. You have to think about it, man. You're 22 now. Petrov gave him a side look. Renee whistled and walked away with a smile. Petrov took a glass of wine from the servant and picked a corner, starting to study the bustling hall in secret. He noticed Aurelia would steal him a glance from now and then in the middle of her conversation. The moment their eyes met, Aurelia soon turned away to avoid his gaze. Petrov noticed a vivid flush gradually rose to her cheeks. He smiled back as a courtesy to him. Aurelia was simply an innocent little girl. Just then, a furious voice on one side of the hall drew everybody's attention. What? He really said that? Yes. Cornelius that coward just came back without even defending his honor. The loudest person exclaimed. Such a shame on Long Song's stronghold. Petrov recognized the man. It was Simon Elliot, a remote branch of the Wolf family, who married a quite beautiful woman. He had seen the wife once. She did possess some unique charm. Like you have a solution to that? Someone retorted with mockeries. Perhaps I can't do anything about it on my own. But if the Duke notices such absurdity, I don't think Roland Wimbledon will still be able to act so unscrupulously. Hearing this familiar name, Petrov was stunned for a moment. He was soon intrigued by this interesting conversation. Chapter 103, The Honeysuckles and the Elks Part 2. Petrov approached the crowd and asked, "What happened?" Mr. Hull, seeing the canon of the Honeysuckle family, someone replied, "We're talking about the Lord of Border Town. He wants to seize the properties that the nobles in the stronghold leave in the town." "Just call me Petrov. What's it exactly about him? Let me explain it to Mr. Petrov." Simon came up to him with a half-fawning smile. "The truth is, we live in Border Town in peacetime on the Duke's order to manage the North Slope mine for him. Every winter, we take our townsmen to Long Song's stronghold and protect them from demonic beasts. When we returned to the town after the months of demons this year, however, one of my colleagues, Cornelius from the Fletcher family, was told by the Lord of Border Town that his residence was torn down by the townspeople and that he would not receive any compensation for his loss. You've got two choices: A, admit that the property doesn't belong to you, and B, imprisonment and being hanged for defection." Simon imitated the tone of Prince Roland. "Sir, how could he charge Cornelius with defection? I dare say all the managers of the mine have been doing this for the past 100 years. The image of the grey-haired young man involuntarily flashed across Petrov's mind. Notwithstanding the prince's widespread notoriety, Petrov, from his personal intercourse with him, knew that Roland Wimbledon was definitely not a person of mediocrity. The so-called defection was merely a pretext Roland used to assert his absolute authority in his territory. He had never planned to reason with these nobles. It appeared that the prince had resolved to sever relations with Long Song's stronghold. Petrov thought that Roland must know very well that the nobles and townsmen took refuge in the stronghold every year. But he still forced Cornelius to make a choice between a death penalty and confiscation of the property. On top of that, he publicized his unreasonable, almost ruthless decision across Long Song's stronghold, which made Petrov wonder what on earth the prince intended to do. "But he's the Lord of Border Town. A lord is entitled to make laws within his territory," the one who had mocked Simon earlier replied. "Border Town is also under the jurisdiction of the Western region," Simon retorted coolly. "Are you challenging Duke Ryan's authority?" The Duke has ordered us to live in the town and manage the mine. Now, Roland has seized all the properties of the nobles. He's defying the 6 families. Duke Ryan will absolutely not tolerate it. Are you talking about the murderer who hanged Keelsmid without even issuing an official document? Renee, who swung by unnoticed, suddenly voiced out. My father was furious about it. Lord Mud. Simon bowed. Yes, that's the man we've been discussing. He's now become more reckless and defiant than ever. I'm afraid we have to rely on the Duke's power to stop him. I hope you can take a message for us. Don't worry. At any rate, Duke Ryan has determined to weed him out, Renee answered carelessly. I came back to let you know that my brother is currently tied up with some business in the King's City. So, it leaves me the only person in the Elk family to command the army. Really? How fantastic! Simon rejoined in delight. Petrov's brows knitted. He knew such a day would eventually arrive after the prince sent out the letter in winter, in which he announced his intention to stay at Border Town. Yet, Petrov had never anticipated his friend would also participate in the war. Ignoring the curious looks of others, Petrov pulled Renee aside and tried to dissuade him. Don't meddle in it. He's a prince. I know he's a prince, but he's just a dummy prince among some country bumpkins. Renee patted Petrov on his shoulder. Don't worry. In any event, Duke Ryan won't hurt a royal family member. Perhaps the prince will surrender soon after we get there. Even if he decides to resist, I'm sure those farmers and miners will flee as soon as we officially launch the attack. Plus, Prince Roland doesn't possess any combating skills. I reckon he'll remain intact during the entire battle. Petrov tried to say something but eventually chose not to speak his thought aloud because he knew Renee would not believe him. Indeed, he himself could hardly believe that the prince would defeat the Alliance army commanded by the Duke with only a bunch of miners, either. Nevertheless, a sense of evil forebodings pervaded him. Master Petrov, your father wants to see you at home. He needs to talk to you. A silver-haired steward walked up to Petrov hastily and whispered to him. Noted. Petrov nodded. After bidding farewell to Renee, he, along with the steward, threw himself into the carriage that conveyed him to the mansion of Earl Honeysuckles. Father. Petrov entered the study and saw Sheriff Hull writing something at his desk. His arrival, however, did not interrupt the Earl's occupation. Send me a report on the production, the population, and revenues in the domain. I can plan for the upcoming war in spring. Duke Ryan has issued an order of conscription. After the snow melts, we 5 families will need to provide our knights and mercenaries to help him attack Border Town. How many people do we have to provide? The Earl paused his writing and looked up. You never cared about these matters. Why are you interested now? He unfolded a letter on the desk and said, 25 knights at least, as well as the squires and horses they need. The 40 mercenaries we need to provide must be fully equipped and armed. As for freemen or serfs, the number should be over 100, and they should be lightly armed. Petrov did a quick math in his head. In that case, the 5 families would be providing around 1,000 people. Combined with the Duke's troops, such an army would be considered unbeatable in the whole western region. It would be an alliance sufficient to suppress the resistance of Border Town, where only 2,000 people in total garrisoned. They did not even need to dispatch all the troops in Long Song's stronghold to gain their victory. Father, can you stay at the rear? After a momentary hesitation, Petrov asked. Why, my child? The Earl was a bit surprised. I'm concerned with your safety. He could not help laughing. Do you know what you're talking about? What danger can there be for an elephant to trump an ant? His Highness has but a few knights and less than 50 guards, whereas our people are 10 times more. Petrov would have also thought so had he not met the prince. Technically, his father was correct. Yet, Father, everybody says a mud city wall will be washed away by the rain, but the one built under His Highness' supervision stood erect in the rain. They've also said it's impossible to stop demonic beasts with merely a group of miners in Border Town, yet His Highness managed to do so. Not a single person fled to the stronghold in the whole course of months of demons this year. Petrov felt increasingly agitated. Now, everyone believes the Duke will subdue Roland Wimbledon in the same way an elephant tramples an ant. Do you really think this will be the case, Father? Enough. He whacked the desk, rose to his feet and shook his head. He walked to the wall upon which the portraits of all the ancestors of the Honeysuckles families were hung. I know you prefer business and trades to battles and wars. However, a tradesman isn't necessarily a coward. For those merchants who sail out to pursue their enterprises, they put their lives on the line every day. He knocked on the wall and hollered. Look at these portraits. Your grandfather and your great-great-grandfather, they fought with their swords and bows against their enemies before establishing themselves on this land full of beasts, refugees, and bandits. Your cowardice really disappointed me. Petrov hanged his head and stopped arguing. He muttered, however, in silence, you also know that these are my grandfather's and great-great-grandfather's stories. Look at their fearless countenances and toned bodies, and then at your own wide waist and your puffy double chin. Father, are you still able to fight on horseback? Chapter 104, The Planning and Recreation. Roland fulfilled his promises on a sunny afternoon. He conferred Tiggy Pine with the title of Viscount and granted him the domain of the South Redwater River, opposite to the river that separated the town. It was a densely grown forest, an area still waiting for development. In order for him to give up the autonomy of territory, Roland had promised to prioritize the development of Tiggy's territory and divide a certain stake of the industrial land established to the Viscount and his descendants. Of course, Roland tactfully described it as an underlining benefit that there would be no work needed to manage the property. He could just sit and wait for the money to roll in. Tiggy happily accepted it. He had never liked these, as nothing was more meaningful to him than fighting on the horse. However, he had diverted his attention to hunting since his daughter was born. In addition, Tiggy asked Prince Roland to sell all his land in the east of Longsong's stronghold and move his family to Border Town as the properties within his domain had long been declining. Roland agreed. The other one was Brian. Roland awarded him identity as a knight and asked him to choose either land or serving in the army. If he chose the land, he would not be allowed to join the First Army of Border Town again. If he joined the army, he would be promoted according to his military exploits to obtain land like the others. Brian chose the latter, without hesitation. Roland had a rough picture of how he would use the land. Using the Redwater River as a border, there was a wide space of 7 to 8 kilometers and a narrow space of about 3 kilometers. The land in between the impassable mountain range was the residential area. It could be used as a construction area or a reward for promoted officers. Opposite the Redwater River was the future industrial and agricultural area. The land could be extended all the way to the Southern Territory. However, it was still covered by forest and hills could be seen some distance away. Roland would have to reclaim the forest when the population fulfilled its demand. Misty Forest, to the east of Border Town, was an important development point. There were all kinds of treasures in the forest, such as wood, edible fungi, wild animals, and herbs. Wood could also be used as fuel, not just for construction and industrial use. The forest was incredibly huge. Roland had sent lightning to explore, and even after flying 30 kilometers, the end was still not seen. If it were only used for the firewood, it could be used for a long time. Finally, the empty space in between the misty forest and the impassable mountain range was also a restricted area that no one ever set foot on. Judging from the boundary of mountains and forests, the Tundish area was vast, a lot larger than the Kingdom of Grey Castle. Roland was very tempted looking at the abandoned land. However, he knew that he could not attend to it for the time being as the population growth of Border Town was more necessary. When he was back in his office in the castle, Roland summoned the artist, Soraya. How's the completion of the task on assisting the city hall? I've never drawn so many pictures in one day. She looked much better compared to their initial encounter. I've almost finished drawing for today. However, it felt a little strange to only see from a window the size of a head when I was drawing. It's to prevent your magic pen from scaring the people, the prince smiled and said, although they know witches exist, such close contact could easily cause an accident. Thus, I would rather take a hidden approach to prevent them from knowing you're a witch. It'll improve it in the future. Soraya's photographic skill had brought Roland's citizenship registration scheme to a new level. The city hall had vacated a house for the planners, the archives, to store the information of the people. They recorded their name, age, address, relationship status and other information on paper. Barov had briefly totaled the information once during the winter, and the record showed it had expanded a lot in this time. The biggest change was that there was now a color photo attached on each personal account. According to Roland's request, the city hall had built a single-access small house in the hall. It was covered with linen from the outside, leaving a square window at the front that allowed Soraya to see the appearance of the other. It prevented them from seeing the magic pen when the witch was painting the portrait. Roland have come up with a very simple method to get the people of the domain to come forward and register. They would be subsidized 10 bronze royals. The money would be paid by the city hall. I've summoned you here today to draw something else, Roland said. He laid the ready-cut papers in front of Soraya. She noticed that the size of each paper was exactly the same. They were all square in shape and only half the size of her palm. What would you like me to draw? A few recreational props, Roland said. He'd had this idea for a while. The witches had basically nothing to do other than their daily practice. Life was getting a little mundane, even to the prince himself. Especially before the snow melted, his range of activities within the castle was limited. Therefore, it was imperative to think of recreational activities and get a few witches to accompany him to relax. The simplest, of course, was poker cards. However, the normal soft paper was not suitable for holding in the hands and shuffling would be troublesome. He could consider making something more advanced with Soraya's help. Recreational? She wondered with her head tilted. She did not understand what kind of recreational thing was to be drawn on a square paper. All right, tell me about it. First, you have to draw a soldier holding a heavy crossbow on this paper. From my imagination? Yes, his armor, body build, age, the surroundings. It's all up to your imagination. The only requirement is he's holding a heavy crossbow. I'll try, said Soraya. She closed her eyes and contemplated for a moment. A set of colorful magic pens appeared in her hands. Soon, an archer who looked like a middle-aged man appeared on the paper. That's great, Roland praised. Let me think what to draw next. Draw a small circle on both the upper left corner and the center of the card. The first circle has a white color base with a gold frame and the second circle has an orange color base with a gold frame. He tried to recall the look of the cards in his mind. When the painting was completed, Roland asked her to add a number in the first circle and the symbol of a bow and arrow in the second circle. Soraya's magic power was that she could ignore the material she was painting on, so blank paper and the patterned paper did not make a difference to her. The formal pattern could be perfectly covered by the newly painted pattern like a cover. Hence, an exquisite archer card appeared in front of Roland. Is that all? She asked. This is just one unit of the cards, there are still more similar cards to be drawn. I'll teach you how to play when it finally forms into a deck of cards. Looking at Soraya painting with her eyes closed, Roland felt a hunch from the bottom of his heart. Perhaps such a conversation would soon fill his castle. What are you going to do? Let's play Gwent first. Chapter 105, The Military Music. Echo was sitting on the highest point of the castle, the roof of the observation tower, where she could see the entire town. She had troubled Lightning to carry her up here, and the little girl would come back to pick her up after sunset. Lightning was currently on her way to Longsong's stronghold. The weather was very good today and the sun was bright. The river in the distance was shining like silk, running slowly towards the west, separating the land of green from the white snow. She felt a sense of warmth and softness in her entire body. This was different from the hot sun of the southernmost region where the scorching rays would burn the skin. She thought. The winds in the mainland varied from the salty sea wind in the port of Clearwater, from the humid monsoon season in the King's City, to the chilling wind in the impassable mountain range, to the earthy breeze in the town here. Anyhow, the winds here were pure and simple. Sweltering heat or sweeping windstorms were common in Iron Sand City. Winds were visible, with gravel and grit mixed up in the howling airflow, like a black monster sweeping through. People would have to hide in their house or find shelter to avoid the wind. Standing in the wind would lead to the death. Echo sighed softly. It had been 4 years since she'd left Iron Sand City. The Osha clan had unfortunately failed in the battle for power. Although her father had surrendered, he was still killed by the enemy. She had wanted to rush forward and perish along with the enemy after witnessing this, but she was knocked out from behind. She wondered how many of the clan members had survived after these 4 years. She'd heard that the Osha clan had violated the agreement of the sacred duel, causing them to be spurned by the 3 gods and exiled to Endless Cape, forbidden from Iron Sand City forever before she was sold to be a slave in the port of Clearwater. However, Echo knew that this was the conspiracy of the Tibia clan. They had smeared the whip with the black oil from the underground and it could not be extinguished once it was ignited. It was this exact trick that had caused her brother, the strongest warrior in the clan, to be burned alive in the duel. It had caused chaos to the team formation. Aside from the scorching hot golden sand, Endless Cape was left with only the never-extinguished fire pillars and the ocean, which was more frantic than Mother Earth. The people heading there would soon turn into bones, and they'd ended up even more miserable than herself as a slave. When Echo awakened and became God's messenger, she wanted revenge. But her ability was the useless sound stimulation. No matter how much she begged the 3 gods, they did not grant her will. After living in the port of Clearwater for half a year, she was clear that the saying that the gods' messengers was loved by the 3 gods was simply the Mojin clan people's self-deceiving lie. The gods' messengers were hunted by the church under the jurisdiction of the 4 kingdoms. Echo had completely lost all hope for revenge since then. There was a sudden rise of smoke from afar. She looked over to the east bank of the Redwater River and noticed the shimmering green flame moving through the woods. The black smoke of the burning trees combined with the white mist that accumulated from the evaporated snow, forming a gray pillar in the sky. It was Anna's green flames. When she arrived, Wendy had briefly introduced Anna and Nana to the sisters. Echo was very envious of Anna's ability. Having the freedom to manipulate high-temperature fire flames that could melt swords. If she'd possessed such a great ability when she was in Iron Sand City, none of the Tibia clan would be left alive. Echo shook her head. There was no point thinking about these things. She was lucky to have survived, especially compared to the people who were probably killed in the yellow sand. Now that His Highness was willing to accept her, all she could do was finish her missions ordered by His Highness. She cleared her throat and started to sing. It was a happy song. She could remember the entire tune even though Prince Roland had only hummed it to her once. Echo was no stranger to music. Seductive dance and flirtatious crooning were skills she'd needed to master when she was trained as a first-class slave. However, this song His Highness requested was totally different. It was full of rhythm and upward vigor, especially when he requested her to perform the music by imitating the flute. It felt like every note was jumping, making people wanted to dance along. The difficulty was in adding in the drums and strings along with the music at the same time. It was Echo's first time to stimulate and overlap all the 3 different sounds at the same time. She had never thought that music could be played like this. Initially, it was difficult for her to make sure that the drum did not interrupt the rhythm of the flute. She managed to gradually merge the 2 sounds together according to His Highness' suggestion by tapping the beat with her hands or feet. After a few days of practice, Echo had gradually mastered the stimulation skill. After singing a few times, she stood up and decided to add in the final string. As the music played, Echo noticed that the minor tune changed again. If the elated fluting formed the body, the passionate drumming had given it a skeleton. and the last seemingly embellished string had given the music its soul. She worked on the beat repeatedly, unifying the three instruments into one. Her voice became increasingly higher and finally she was singing loudly. My attack power was higher than yours, so I won. Roland put his final card on the table, and Soraya sat opposite to him. She covered her face and cried softly in awe. Let's play another round, she said after a moment of contemplation. She gathered the cards again and said, I'll draw your 10 cards this time. Ahem, Roland coughed and said, it's getting late and I still have something to do. You can play with someone else. After making a roughly sufficient set of cards, replication was the next step. Soraya's drawing skill was comparable to the copier machine when the template was in front of her. Soon, Roland had a few sets of Gwent cards. Hence, Soraya became his first opponent. After stating the game rules clearly, a card war was launched. In the card war, Roland found that the witch's acceptance was higher than most ordinary people. Soraya had quickly mastered card handling. Although Roland still managed to win for the following rounds, he had to use the special cards. He had to shamefully refuse now as she requested to draw the cards for him. All right. Soraya carried the cards in her arms and ran out the door. This was when the cheerful music came through the window. She stopped and ran back into the room and stuck her head out of the window to take a look. Is that Echo? Aha. She seems to be quite proficient. Roland leaned back against the chair to enjoy the familiar music. The first army of Bordered Town would soon enter the comprehensive exercising stage. It was quite different from shooting on the city wall. The comprehensive exercise would be carried out in the wild and required the team to march forward in an orderly fashion. This was also the basic segment of a shooting execution lineup. In order to unify the steps of the soldiers, they needed to rely on drums or slogans to command everyone's marching speed. With the witch's ability of mixed sound stimulation, he simply imitated the British style of infantry march music. Compared to simple drumming, the infantry march music could not only control the platoon's marching speed but also help to effectively enhance and elevate the troop morale. Of course, the famous marching song, The British Grenadiers, should be used during the shooting execution lineup. Unfortunately, Roland could only remember the name but not the entire tune. This was no trouble for him as there was another song, based on the British Grenadiers that had been widely used across the country during the War of Resistance. And, the melody was known by almost everyone. It was the widely known Guerrillas song. Soraya turned around as she heard Prince Roland humming along softly. It was in a language that she'd never heard before, clear-cut and perfectly consistent with the beat. We're all sharpshooters. One bullet for one enemy. We're all soldiers with wings, unafraid of tall mountains and deep waters. In the dense forests, our comrades set their camps. On the tall mountains, there are our countless brothers. Chapter 106, A Different Reason. Scroll knocked on the door and someone quickly answered, Come in. Entering the room, she saw Anna sitting at a table by the window, where she was reading a thick book. The sun streamed through the window, lengthening her silhouette. Her soft cheeks and delicate neck looked fair under the sun's reflection, and her ash brown hair, that covered her shoulders, almost appeared gold. After getting along with her for a week, Scroll had basically understood Anna's temperament, such as straightforward, honest, steady and quiet, especially studious. In short, it was difficult to find a civilian who had a pure and peaceful soul like Anna. Are you going to play the card game? Scroll moved a stool and sat down beside Anna. After practice, the sisters would rush back to the castle and squeeze into Soraya's room to play Gwent. They had fun and enjoyed fighting for cards from each other's collections. Even Anna Pine, who had been playing with Anna daily, had been coming by less after learning how to play the game. It was uncommon since the little girl with the magic healing power was almost always to be found in Anna's room. I want to keep reading. Anna turned the page and said, I don't have an ability like yours, so I should spend more time on this. She had read all kinds of books, everything from historical biographies to long poetry, including the folk tales Scroll had heard being told in the streets. She was interested in all things, as long as it was in a book. Scroll lovingly patted her head and said, "Don't worry. I'll tell you all that I remember in the books." Scroll thought. Nightingale would have never come to Border Town, nor met with Prince Roland from the Kingdom of Grey Castle, and everything else that happened after would not have happened either. In other words, she was the savior of all witches. That was partially why she was so fond of Anna. When Scroll had gained the insight from the Book of Magic, Anna had quickly accepted her and showed her great admiration, so much so that Scroll considered it a little ridiculous. There had been no one admiring her ability in the Witch Cooperation Association. Anna had the largest capacity for magic that Scroll had ever seen, with the exception of Nightingale, and her ability to control the green flames came with a very high attack power. "Your hair is a little long." Scroll lifted Anna's bangs out of her eyes and said, "Does no one help you cut your hair?" She shook her head and said, "I'd normally thread it myself." Scroll's interest was immediately piqued and she said, "Threaded hair doesn't look as good, let me trim it for you." "Do you even know how to do this?" "I gave most of the sisters their haircuts when I was in the Witch Cooperation Association." Scroll smiled and then said, "Hold on a moment and I'll get my tools." She quickly came back with a sack clutched in her hand. After spreading out the folded layers of white cloth, a pair of bronze scissors were revealed. They were well worn, both sides of the grips were covered with scratches and the blades had been polished from frequent use. Scroll had relied on this pair of scissors for a living before joining the Witch Cooperation Association. She had been a hairdresser in the pub of Sea Winshire. The extra bronze royals she had earned, after buying bread, was given to a captain with a broken leg in exchange for him teaching her how to read and write. This went on until he passed away from old age. Scroll proficiently shook out and spread the white cloth over Anna, carefully tying it around her neck, and adeptly began trimming the long pieces of hair. "I have a question to ask you." "What's that?" Scroll's fingers were dancing with the scissors in her hand, the blades constantly opening and closing, making a crisp cutting noise. Anna's ash-brown hair adeptly slipped through her fingers, falling to the floor, cluster by cluster. "About the book you gave me yesterday, many of the stories end in the same way. Is it fated for a prince to marry a princess?" Her hand paused a moment. The storybook was not a typical book, it was a collection of folks' tales that she had heard living in Sea Winshire over the years. However, Scroll had filtered out the stories without a happy ending, where the prince and princess didn't end up together, and compiled them into the book Anna was reading. She had known that Anna would ask about this after reading the stories, however, she did not want to answer honestly. Most of them do, of course. There are some situations where a prince marries a Grand Duke's daughter. For example, King Wimbledon III of the Kingdom of Grey Castle married the daughter of Duke Silverlight. After replying, Scroll silently sighed, feeling it in her heart. Wendy had mentioned Nightingale's thoughts to her, but when compared to the mature and calm Shadow Killer, she felt more concern about Anna, to whom His Highness felt affection. Everyone could see her importance to him. Roland could not keep his eyes off Anna whenever she was around. She was busier than the other sisters and he did not change her sleeping arrangements. After bunking Nightingale and Wendy together, Roland had explained that Nana could share a bed with Anna when she stayed the night, never realizing that his decision needed no explanation since he was the lord of the manor. Anna's reactions to His Highness were similar. She wouldn't really talk when she was with the other witches and preferred to be a quiet listener. However, she would become active and more animated when Roland was around. Scroll thought that if there was ever something or someone that could tear Anna's eyes from a book, it would have to be Prince Roland. Unfortunately, Roland was the fourth prince of the Kingdom of Grey Castle and the future king. He would be supported by the witches and Anna was one of those witches. This was not something she could tell Prince Roland, so she had to find a way to indirectly mention it to Anna. She didn't want there to be any misunderstandings, but she also didn't want to see it end in tragedy. "Why?" Anna shook her head, knocking the broken pieces of hair off her neck. "What if the prince doesn't like the princess or the lady from the noble's family?" Scroll didn't think that she would ask that. He would still have to marry one. Since the prince is likely destined to be king, his marriage isn't just up to him. She tried to remember the relevant knowledge recorded in the book. As a way to stabilize and unify the nobles from the bordering kingdoms, and to appease the shifting neighboring countries, or to even make strategic deals, a king had to marry for the benefit of his people. However, most importantly, the king must have heirs. Anna did not continue to pursue her question, and Scroll felt relieved. This delicate of a matter would take time and careful persuasion, and she thought that someday Anna would understand. After she had finished trimming Anna's bangs, she brushed them with her fingers and smiled. "Not bad, you look more energetic." Anna bowed and said, "Thank you." "So, for today's book?" Scroll contemplated a moment and then decided to summon a book about the revolution of the Kingdom of Wolfheart's history. She thought this book would support the information she imparted today. "Let's pick a family biography." She was about to leave when Anna suddenly spoke with the Book of Illusion in her arms. "I don't think Roland is the prince in these stories." She sounded certain and not as if she were trying to persuade herself. He would do what he wanted, regardless of his imparted duty. Scroll was shocked. "What makes you say that? If he was a prince like in the stories, he wouldn't have rescued me." Chapter 107, Will You Marry a Witch? Roland went back to his office so he could continue writing down the basic mathematical knowledge he had in his mind after dinner. He did not have an extraordinarily retentive memory, not to mention his memory would decline over time. Due to his profession, mathematics and physics were the most frequently used subjects, while his information about history, geography, biology, chemistry and so on had degenerated to an entry level. Thus, regardless of its usefulness, it was better for him to take notes about everything in order to retain more knowledge. After he finished each page, he would have Scroll committed to memory. All she had to do was look over the page and it was permanently recorded. Unfortunately, Scroll's ability only extended to the memory of looking at the information, and she could not teach herself junior high school mathematics. So, Roland explained it to her when he was free. Of course, for someone like him, teaching was a meaningful task. When Scroll was surprised or enlightened, after a long contemplation, he felt especially accomplished. However, Roland knew that this had to do with his specific student. Although Scroll was closer to 40 in age, her magic power had greatly slowed the aging process. The skin on her cheeks was tight and rosy, and her long black hair was tied back simply behind her head, making her look very mature and capable. The fine crow's feet at the corners of her eyes did not destroy her overall beauty but rather brought out her steady temperament. She would definitely be the elegant and versatile teacher found in the movies. The sense of role reversal was pleasant now that he had surprised the teacher with his lesson. Roland was quietly writing as he contemplated. It was everywhere, and it did not matter if its source was in the deep mine of the northern slope or within the impassable mountain range, off towards the wild places in the west, or located at the sea windsure in the east. The witches could always use it to release their various and incredible powers. The power was obviously stronger than electricity, and its energy was less processed and closer to its origins. Like with Kara from the Witch Cooperation Association, Wendy had mentioned that she could summon 4 snakes of different magical types, and their names were named Death, Suffering, Fossilization, and Nothingness, each with its own venom effect. Or, like Nightingale, and her unfolding mist that could almost distort the space it occupied. The different forms of magic ability constantly changed. Roland could not think of a better word to use other than the origins. If he were to give the word origins a definition, it probably would be the rules and order that control everything universal. In the latter part of his life, Einstein wanted to integrate the 4 basic forces of the universe into his theoretical framework and called it the Grand Unification Theory. In a way, he was searching for its source, so Roland couldn't help but wonder if there was a universal rule that could span any universe. Roland couldn't help but brainstorm. Was it possible a force like that existed in the world he used to live in before he traveled across the universe? Had there just not been any witches to act as a catalyst, releasing the magic, and it was only neglected by others? Roland was just thinking. Besides, there was no way for him to properly analyze the power with the currently available technologies. So, in order to promote the Industrial Revolution, he had to concentrate on propelling the progress of civilization. Perhaps, someday, mankind would be able to use the power without the assistance of the witches. It was exciting to simply think about the versatile energy, which could transform into various effects. Your Highness? Scroll asked, noticing Roland's intoxicated look. Ahem, Roland pulled himself from the delusion. He coughed twice and said, while looking at the dwindling candle, "That's all for today." Yes, she bowed and prepared to leave, but then she paused. Roland noticed that he had not heard the sound of the door closing and looked up curiously and saw that Scroll was still standing by the door. "What's up, Your Highness?" Scroll hesitated for a moment before saying, "I would like to ask you a question." "Ask away." Roland nodded while laying his quill down before lifting his glass of water and taking a large gulp. The witches didn't have many shortcomings, except one: they were all too skittish. They were like rabbits that would poke their heads out of their cave, only to immediately retreat at the slightest disturbance, never to be seen again. He was predicting that her question would be something like, "Why were you willing to take us in? Or don't you fear the church?" Nightingale and Wendy had asked him many that times. However, since Scroll had taken the time to ask, he would answer her seriously, deepening their friendship and camaraderie. "Is it possible for you to marry a witch?" PFFT, Roland almost spat out his water. Why are you asking?" Scroll opened her mouth but could not answer. Marry a witch? The first person who came to Roland's mind was Anna. Ever since the day he had met her in the prison, her blue eyes had left a deep impression on his heart. Witches started as ordinary, human girls, but then their abilities would awaken and they would develop outstanding powers. Moreover, their appearances and bodies were superior to those of a normal human. They would be the focus of attention in the modern society. So, what did he have to hesitate about? In this case, he looked at Scroll and asked with a smile, "Why not?" Wendy rubbed her sore shoulders before returning to her room. Her large breasts were troublesome, especially when she was casting her wind on the top of the little town's wooden shed, since she had to raise her arms up and slightly towards her back to keep balance. Since the first sail trial, Littletown had made a lot of improvements. For example, there was now a simple shed built on the spot she would be standing to shelter her from the sun and the rain. The hull was surrounded by bark that was used to reduce the impact when it went ashore. Both sides of the ship were fitted with 2 cement short piles for the convenience of fixing the vessels, and her ability to control the wind had also made a great progress after nearly a month of training. The ships were moving more steadily now, and the speed could be fast or slow under the influence of the wind. She even learned to adjust the magic consumption by using the existing wind force so that she could last a longer time. Nightingale had finished her bath before Wendy, and she was already sitting on her bed, in her pajamas, waiting for her. However, Wendy found it strange that Nightingale was smiling uncontrollably. Did something good happen? Wendy couldn't help asking. Nightingale shook her head but didn't say anything. She only smiled a little wider. Wendy's mouth twitched. Her emotions has been low since the last time we talked. Only recently, with the growing popularity of Gwent, has her spirits been lifted. Then, why is she smiling so brightly? Where has the expressionless, quiet shadow killer I met in Silver City gone? Wendy took off her clothes and stepped into the bucket of hot water. Chapter 108, Echo Part 1. It's been 2 months since the months of demons had ended, and the snow had finally turned melted into streams which ran into the Redwater River. Once the white landscape slowly faded away, the trees on both sides began to sprout again. Everything became green once more. The land to the east of the town had already been cleared by Anna with her flames, and His Highness had temporarily turned it into a training ground for the First Army of Border Town. At the training ground, Carter Lannis was holding a casing and was checking if the bayonet was firmly installed. This was the newest invention of His Highness, But compared to the automatic operating machine and the modified snow powder, this new invention seemed to be a little too simple. When holding it in his hands, Carter instantly realized that it was not a qualified weapon. In short, it was just a sharp iron triangle, with the middle line as the base, with the other two sides pointing inwards a little. Although it had a sharp edge, it was impossible to use it to cut down enemies. The blade was just too narrow after it was bent. Even if he was to attack an enemy without armor, if he tried to slash out horizontally, Carter was not sure he would even be able to cut apart the enemy's clothes. This weapon had only one purpose, and that was stabbing. And it required being connected to the flintlock for its use. When used alone, it would not be as handy as a dagger. In the eyes of the chief knight, wasting so much pig iron, only to forge such a simplistic weapon was totally unacceptable. If a blacksmith within his territory had dared to create such a weapon, he would have tied the man and given him a proper beating. But even for a bad weapon like this, he could still see His Highness' attention to details. For example, the design of the casing. The mouth of the barrel had two grooves with a right angle at its end, so as long as the pieces were fitted properly and the bayonet was turned slightly it would become fixed. Because of this design, the pieces did not need to fit perfectly, and if they were a little too loose, some paper could be inserted between the two iron pieces and the grooves, and in case there was no paper, even tree leaves would work instead. Put the bayonet on the gun. Hearing the command, the members of the flintlock squad who had a bayonet allocated to them took them out of their bag and put them on the gun's barrel. Until now there were only about 40 pieces of the new weapon and supporting bags. So the ones who did not receive a new weapon had to use a short stick instead. They practiced this action for almost the whole morning, and now most of them only needed just a few seconds to adjust the bayonet. According to His Highness' words, the bayonet should only be used as a last resort. He did not want his men to fight a close combat fight. Carter disagreed with this statement. He thought as long as someone did not personally stab an enemy, they would still be considered as children. Only when they saw their enemy's first blood, they would transform from ordinary miners and hunters into soldiers. Iron Axe was also in the platoon. Although he claimed to only be a hunter, Carter could see from his skills that the man had definitely received military training before. His skills were not much worse than that of the other knights. When His Highness asked Carter to teach the soldiers how to use the new weapon, he did not feel very confident. He never heard of a weapon called bayonet before, so there was a chance that he did not even know how to use it. However, after seeing the prototype, he became full of confidence. After all, the bayonet was just like a short spear, and due to its special blade, it was much easier to use it compared to a spear. The advantage of the bayonet was in the simplicity of learning to use it. There was no need to learn how to slash, lift, block or sweep. There was only one move, stabbing. So the chief knight let all the platoon members line up and taught them the most appropriate way of stabbing, placing one foot behind the other, bending the knees and the waist and pushing their arms forward with their maximum strength. This kind of repetitive training was extremely boring. But what amazed Carter was that everyone was meticulously completing the stabbing training. Before the winter they were all still a bunch of weak and lazy civilians, but now they were behaving properly. They would immediately follow any command, and training them was even easier than training a squire. Of course, if you were to give them a sword, or using the words of His Highness cold weapons, these people still would not stand a chance against his men. But in terms of willpower, their progress was really notable in his eyes. After half an hour of training, Carter let the flintlock squad sit down and rest. At this moment, His Highness the Prince showed up on the training ground, accompanied by a woman who was wearing a hood. The knight was not surprised. His Highness had informed him in advance that they would be assisted by a witch during today's training. However, that witch was pretty tall. She was almost as tall as His Highness. Girls are more attractive if they are shorter, Carter thought. He then told everyone to stand up and greet the fourth prince. "Greetings, Your Highness." The soldiers shouted and raised their hands. "Thank you for your effort," Roland nodded. As he was about to speak to the knight, a soldier suddenly rushed out of the team. Carter Lannis frowned. He stepped forward, placing the prince behind himself with his hand already touching his sword. Nightingale had also appeared, grabbing Roland's arm, waiting to drag the prince into the mist in case something went wrong. The person who appeared was exactly Iron Axe. He did not run to the prince, but instead to the unknown witch, immediately falling down to his knees in front of her. It was not the kingdom's normal kneeling posture. Instead, he threw his whole body flat on the ground, with his head buried between his arms. Clan leader. With this, the Flintlock Squad's training came to an end. Back in the castle hall, Carter, Echo, and Iron Axe stood in a row, while Roland sat on the throne. He asked, clearly dissatisfied. Discipline, discipline. You have to always maintain discipline in the platoon. Not to mention seeing a clan leader. Even if you were to see the king, you should not move an inch. If there is any request, there is always time for a report later. Your Highness. Iron Axe wanted to kneel down, but just as he leaned over, he was stopped by Roland. Stand straight and speak. Yes. Iron Axe swallowed nervously, and said, Master Silvermoon is the clan leader I served back in Iron Sand City. No, Carbago, I am not the clan leader. Echo quickly waved her hands. No, you are, Iron Axe responded. After the death of your father and brother, according to the Mokin custom, you became the clan leader of our Osha clan. I heard that you were sold to the port of Clearwater, but I didn't find you there, so I thought you were dead. But I'm... Roland interrupted Echo, one by one. You first, Iron Axe. Yes, Your Highness. The story was not complicated, so Roland quickly understood the general idea of what happened. Echo was originally a member of the Osha clan in Iron Sand City. Her real name was Dro Silvermoon, and her father was the clan leader of the Osha clan. The Sand Nation was not unified, and Iron Sand City was only able to accommodate a limited population, so every now and then, each clan had to take part in a sacred duel, and the 6 victorious clans would gain the right to live in the city, while the other clans had to either live outside the city, or camp at the Green Sea. Although there were water resources in these places, the wild beasts and the sandstorms would cause a great threat to the Sand People. So during each of the sacred duels, the warriors of the various clans would spare no effort in order to win. Chapter 109, Echo Part 2. Unfortunately, the Osha clan lost to the Iron Whip clan, who had used insidious means during the duel. The Osha leader was killed and the clan ended up being exiled to Endless Cape. Dro Silvermoon, now known as Echo, was the daughter of the former clan leader, and because of her extraordinary looks, she was sold as a first-class slave to a slaver at port of Clearwater. Iron Axe was of mixed blood, and despite his being adopted by the Osha clan, he was never regarded as a real Mojin person by the Sand Nation. For this reason, he escaped the fate of exile. Instead, other clans highly regarded him and they wanted to recruit him due to his excellent combat abilities. However, Iron Axe felt loyalty towards the Osha clan leader and was grateful for all of his help over the years, which, coupled with his desire to save Echo, made him resolutely reject the offers from the other clans. After a long and difficult journey, he finally arrived at port of Clearwater. Unfortunately, he was too late and Echo had already been sold to the Kingdom of Grey Castle. Ultimately, Echo had been rescued by the witches and joined the Witch Cooperation Association, while Iron Axe headed to the western region of Grey Castle, with a broken spirit. Today they unexpectedly ran into each other in Bordered Town. After a moment Roland asked, "So what's your plan? Do you want to return to the southernmost region with Echo and revive the Osha clan?" "No, Your Highness." Iron Axe went down on one knee. "I've already sworn to the 3 gods that I'll serve you for the rest of my life. It's just... I was so excited to see Lady Silvermoon again that I couldn't control my emotions. Please punish me." "What about you?" the prince asked, looking at Echo. "Do you want to go and avenge your people?" Echo also knelt in front of the prince before replying. "After my awakening as a witch, I did have thoughts of revenge, but that was a long time ago." She bit her lip. "Please allow me to stay. I don't have anywhere else to go." "I understand." "Stand up, both of you," Roland said quietly. You don't have to act contrite, and I haven't said anything yet." He paused a moment before saying empathetically, "You know, it's not impossible for me to help you get your revenge." "What?" Iron Axe opened his eyes in shock, unable to believe his own ears. Echo, on the other hand, did not react. After all this time she had given up hope of ever returning to Iron Sand City. "Of course, not right this very moment." Roland waved his hand dismissively. This idea of his had not been mere whimsy. According to Iron Axe's descriptions of the southernmost region, he had heard about some very interesting things: the hot and dry land with a strange terrain, how the ground would spew forth orange flames that could burn for decades, never to be extinguished. Near the flames, the ground had eroded into many pits, and in their depths, and one could see the Black Styx's river. Orange fire and the Styx's river. The more Roland thought about it, the more he believed. That sounds like oil. Better still, it sounds like free-flowing oil. There was no point in thinking about the importance of the black liquid to industrial development, and more than half of the modern-day wars were over oil. The rise and fall of oil prices could even impact the wealth and success of many countries, changing the structure of the world. If he was able to establish a foothold in the southernmost region, through the Osha clan, he would acquire a stable oil source. But for now, Roland would not concern himself with remote disputes. He would, however, keep it in the back of his mind and eventually stage this once in a lifetime. "After I take the throne, I'll find a way to get justice for you." Roland again stopped Iron Axe from kneeling. "But, as for today, you violated an order of the First Army. You're sentenced to 2 days of confinement, and during these days, you're to reflect on your actions." "Yes, Your Highness," Iron Axe happily replied. "Then let us continue your training," Roland said to the chief knight, "and you'll be responsible for the next march." Carter nodded. Brian had thought that today's training had already finished. However, everyone was still on the training ground, and no one dared to leave. When Carter left with the prince, he ordered them to rest on site, but he had not dismissed them. On his old patrol team, this type of situation would be unthinkable. "Your Excellency, do you think His Excellency Iron Axe will come back?" asked Nail, from his team. "His actions just now startled me." "How many times have I told you not to call me like that?" Brian corrected him. "In the First Army, you should address me as team leader. His Highness told us to use military terms." After he was knighted by Prince Roland, his rank within the army rose up. The rest of the team no longer talked to him, except for Nail, a short fellow who had been a miner before joining the platoon. He often came by to chat. According to Nail, he not only talked with a knight, he had even claimed to have had close conversations with Prince Roland himself too. This was a special situation. His Highness can't blame him too much, right? Although he agreed with this, Brian was not too sure about it. He once saw a civilian who had accidentally collided with the Lord's carriage killed on the spot by the Lord's guards. Iron Axe was a foreigner, and he had bowed to another while His Highness was present, even called her clan leader. No matter how you looked at it, it was a clear break of etiquette. "My guess is that'll be the case," nodded Nail. "I've spoken to His Highness personally, and he isn't like other nobles." He scratched his head, trying to find the right words. "Even though he looks like most nobles, he acts completely different." Brian also did not want something bad to happen to Iron Axe. After over a month of training together, he felt a deep sense of respect for him, especially after he had taught them how to build a tent during their field training. They had all benefited from his superb skills and his enjoyable teaching method. In Brian's eyes, Iron Axe was even more suitable than Carter Lannis to be the commander of the First Army. "They're already back." Nail brushed against Brian's arm. "Hey, I can't see His Excellency Iron Axe." Before his imagination could run wild, Carter had already ordered them to get into formation. Then, His Highness Roland stepped forward and began to give a speech. "The woman standing beside me is a witch. Her name is Echo, and she's an acquaintance of Iron Axe. They have been separated for many years. However, because Iron Axe disrupted formation and violated the military rules, He has been sentenced, by me, to confinement for 2 days, as dictated by the rules. I'll repeat this once more. You all now belong to the regular army, and the most important rule for a member of this army is to obey orders and maintain discipline. Do you understand this? Yes, Your Highness. Brian and the rest shouted. After hearing about Iron Axe's fate, he finally calmed down. Nail, who was still next to him, was looking at him while making a wry face. In the next training exercise, Echo will aid you. Her ability allows her to imitate sounds, such as musical instruments, trumpets, and drums. The marching song that she'll play next will be the signal for you to act. Everyone has to move to the beat of the drums while maintaining your formation in one line. Here, His Highness paused. On the battlefield, Echo will be standing behind you. She'll be the banner of the First Army, the soul of the Flintlock Squad. You'll have to protect her at every cost. Now, everyone should become familiar with the melody. What's a marching song? Brian was confused. Is it something like the music they occasionally play in pubs? Is it appropriate to use that soft music to direct the march of the army? But, once he heard the melody coming out of Echo's mouth, he instantly realized what His Highness had meant. The rhythm of the drum deeply affected him, which made him want to move forward while provoking his desire to fight. This so-called marching song was a battle hymn that would encourage and motivate everyone on the battlefield. Chapter 110, The Battle of Eagle City Part 1. Through the misty morning fog, Timothy Wimbledon could indistinctly see the flags flying on top of the city wall. He raised his telescope, trying to make out the cannon on the flags. Most of the flags were green, each embroidered with a sailing ship and a crown on it. Undoubtedly, they belonged to his sister, Garcia Wimbledon. The second most seen flag was a white flag, with a high tower which had a viper wrapped around it, and this belonged to the House Ballier. Ha! He sneered in his heart. Earl Ballier, how shameless of you to keep your flag flying high after surrendering to the Queen of Clearwater. I'll feed you your flags as soon as you fall into my hands, traitor. The least flown flag was red and it was embroidered with a high tower and a lion. This flag belonged to House Zeta, who was just as shameless as the rest. Timothy showed no external emotion even though in his heart he had already sentenced Aaron Zeta, and Tom and Ballier, to death. Of course, Aaron Zeta also had to eat his flags. Surname, raise the flags of the Kingdom of Greycastle. Timothy commanded. Yes, Your Majesty. Frostwind Knight replied before galloping off to tell the army behind him. The king orders to raise the flags. The new king turned his head and watched as one by one, the grey flags were being raised, flying high in the wind. The image was a black pattern depicting a huge tower with inclining and intercrossed spears on both sides, making the flag look solemn. This was the emblem for the King of Greycastle, and any traitor would be beheaded before it. As soon as news of the independence of Garcia reached his ears, he took immediate action by mobilizing the troops of the eastern region and the King's City and then marching on Eagle City. Although in his heart he was terrified, he had maintained a calm face, giving the ministers who stood by his side a boost of confidence. It took almost a month to summon the landowners and troops, and then a week on the road to the eastern region, followed by half a month to reach here. Yesterday, Timothy finally arrived at Eagle City at sunset. Fortunately, the months of demons did not affect the King's City much, therefore, the road in the Southern Territory was not hindered by snow. Instead, the frozen ground made the carts of food move even faster. His army was quite large and mainly comprised of his own guards, the knightage of the King's City, and the troops of Duke Francis Clit of the Eastern region. The three groups totaled to over 6,000 men, and up to 1,000 of them were well-trained and armed knights. According to a reliable source, Garcia had no more than 3,000 men, most of whom were the freemen of Port of Clearwater. They might be qualified enough to plunder unarmed farmers or merchants, but they would never stand a chance against the knights. Gowd, his treasurer, had advised that it was not a good time to call the army after the end of the months of demons because the farming in each land would start soon, and the lack of men would harm the harvest. Timothy took the advice. He allowed his landowners to keep their serfs and called the freemen on his land to take on the job of logistics and transportation. This way the spring farming would still take place even while they were fighting in the Southern Territory. In any case, Timothy Wimbledon would never allow Garcia to stay in the Southern Territory. Eagle City, which was not as stoutly built, had been designated a trade market, situated in the middle of the peripheral towns. As time went on, the market grew into a young city with a history of less than a century. Furthermore, the previous lords intentionally left out the construction of a defensible wall to give the impression of a trade city. Garcia's army that totaled 3,000 civilians and the men from the two earls was not large or strong in Timothy's view. Accordingly, the quicker they reacted, the more of a chance they stood. If he offered Garcia enough time to organize the entire Southern Territory, she would be more difficult to defeat. After a good night's rest and full bellies, his troops were ready for war. As the sun rose, changing from a bright orange into a radiating gold, the mist dissipated and the brown wall was revealed. This was not a wall but more of a bare soil slope, in the new king's opinion. The incline made the slope easy to climb with just bare hands and feet. There was no need for ladders. On the top of the slope stood wooden bars, all the height of the men. While this might deter the refugees and thieves, it would not stop the trained soldiers. The men guarding this wall were scattered and obviously not ready to defend the city. Your Majesty, the scout on the south gate reported that a large party is on the move. Frostwind Knight rode to the new king and he reined in his horse to make his report. Timothy handed his telescope over to Duke Francis and said in a relaxed voice, "It seems she intends to run away." The Duke watched the city for a while before nodding. She made a bold decision quickly. "We'll take them all if she plans on putting her men in Eagle City. She won't be able to defend herself there for very long." As the Duke said this, he laughed. "As you predicted at the council meeting last night, our quick response caught her off guard." "We've arrived at the right time," Timothy said. "She couldn't slip away at night even if she intended to." "Exactly, to march the army at night would be taboo. If she does decide to move at night, her army will be scattered even if we don't attack. It's impossible to gather your men once they have scattered in darkness. Thus, she's still doomed even if she does make it back to Port of Clearwater. So, my dear sister has to wait until the break of dawn to retreat with the army." Timothy looked at Eagle City. It was finally within his grasp. Filled with satisfaction, he believed his sister had done exactly as he had expected. Garcia had set up her army in Eagle City, a place she had desired for a long time. Strategically, seizing the house from the previous wards of the Southern Territory provided an advantage and allowed one to buy the loyalty of the noble in the South. And, yet the crisis came with it. Thinking ahead, he had deployed a decoy army to draw attention, while he secretly led the riders to the eastern region in advance. This left behind the infantries but allowed carts to secretly carry the war supply. After the decoy army had entered the eastern region, the Duke would contribute to the troops to reinforce them. Then he would lead the march on Eagle City through the other side of the kingdom. As they moved forward, the riders would run ahead to block the road, in order to reduce the possibility of any information leaking from spies. Garcia might have received the rough news 2 or 3 days before she decided to retreat her army at dawn, which was a hasty march since there was no time for preparation. They would have to walk for a day to get from Eagle City to the town of Clear Spring, and even so, they could never outpace his riders. As long as he rallied 1,000 riders to chase after her and pick off the enemy from behind, her funny coalition would automatically collapse. It was a pity that Garcia could still escape if she abandoned her 3,000 men and fled alone. If she did that, it would be easy for her to reach Port of Clearwater alive. He thought that hunting her down in her lair would end the farce. "Your Majesty, do we split up according to the plan?" Duke Francis said. "Do you intend to cross the city at the south gate, and start the chase after I break into the city, or will you take a detour that'll add time?" "I think it's better to take the detour to the southwest." Timothy pondered for a while. The narrow street would be inconvenient, and furthermore, Garcia might block the street with junk to hinder the riding troops. A detour, while it might cost us 2 extra hours, won't affect the pursuit of the enemy. Then it's time for me to set out, Your Majesty. Be careful. Timothy warned him. Garcia may not have left many of her troop behind in the city, but I assume there will be lots of traps. Moreover, be aware of the narrow streets or any place crowded with houses. This is where ambushes from Garcia's loyal men are likely to take place. Ha ha ha. Duke Francis laughed brightly. Please, trust me, Your Majesty. Since the wound I received from following your father into battle, I haven't sustained one since. And I have single-handedly beheaded hundreds of men. He waved his hand to the guards beside him. Blow the horn and begin the attack. The army behind him started to surge, with some of the platoons moving out of formation. Led by knights, they marched towards Eagle City. They were the vanguards, made up of civilians. They were followed by armored mercenaries which were the main force of the siege. At the same time, the riders brought by the Duke all rallied under his banner. Timothy waited until the main army had attacked the wall before leading the rest of the knights and squires southwest. Chapter 111, The War of the Eagle City Part 2. The freemen who were treated as cannon fodder had successfully climbed up the slope without any resistance. However, wooden barriers blocked their way. Rather than being tightly built with wooden logs, the barriers bore gaps that allowed spears to thrown through so that the defenders only needed to stand behind the barrier as they attacked the enemies with spears. Yet, Duke Francis didn't expect that the men that were guarding on top of the wall had disappeared, leaving the outer ring of the wall unguarded. The vanguards breached the barrier with axes and brought down a few logs before pouring into the top of the wall. After a while, the wooden gate was laid down as well. Let's move. Duke flicked the reins, leading the remaining army to march on. It takes us not more than 30 minutes from the start to the laydown of the gate. What is Garcia Wimbledon plotting? Francis frowned. Anyone who had a little war experience would know that when the leader abandoned the city, he would leave behind some guards or buy some expensive gutsy men, who knew not fear of death, to resist the enemy and buy as much time as possible for the main army to retreat. Princess Garcia is no fool. After all, she conquered the entire southern territory in such a short period of time. Why doesn't she deploy the men to guard the wall? The defenses and traps, no matter how strong and tricky they are, will have no use when they are unmanned. Duke Francis pondered and decided to send the guards into the city in advance to check on the situation. The information that the captain of the guards reported was the same as what they had seen on the wall. There was no resistance in the city either. Only some streets were barricaded by timbers and bricks, and his men had gathered the residents to clean the blockades. Francis led the rest of the army into Eagle City without any hesitation. He believed that he, a proven veteran who had followed King Wimbledon III to war for many years, would not be scared stiff by a young girl. It seemed to Francis that Timothy had made the mistake, since he could have saved a lot of time if he chose to cross the city after Francis took it. As he passed through the gate, the Duke smelled something strong. It was not the rotten stink that was common on the battlefield, but something like a mixture of pine nut oil, orange peel and incense. If drawing a deep breath, he could even smell fragrant. What is it? He looked around and found nothing special. Since the ditch that was for draining water off the wall was plugged up, the sewage had overflowed and ran along the ground slowly. Moreover, the dirty accumulation that had been left alone for an unknown time was dark black, reflecting a colorful light pattern in the sun. Maybe it was the smell of the sewage, Francis thought while shaking his head, and walked into the castle with the platoon. Now that I've taken Eagle City, it's natural to stroll around the Lord's Castle and City Hall to check if there is anything valuable to take. Certainly, Garcia must have plundered the city. But there are still some larger crafts and decorations that will be appropriate booties. And the food carts are good enough to carry the booties after they've been roughly cleaned up. As for the mercenaries, they must be heading to the stores and farms. Leave them alone. Anyway, Duke Joey is dead and no one knows whom will be the new lord. Robbing the entire city comes first. After he walked through the entire lord's castle, Francis discovered something wrong. The castle was too empty, he thought. He couldn't even find any cloth or food in the basement, not to mention the gold. The wall where there should have been paintings on it was now blank, and the bookcase had no books either. What's queerer was that the bed in the Lord's chamber was gone too. The castle looked like it had been stripped. How could they take away all these things when they were in a rushed retreat? Francis started to sense that the situation was not as good as he had thought. The castle wouldn't be so empty unless they had started to transport these things early. When he was about to head to the city hall, a thick black smoke suddenly billowed over the north gate. What's wrong? Something caught on fire? I have no idea, my lord. I've sent Molière to check it out, the captain said. Maybe it was the enemy who started a fire on purpose. At first the Duke thought it was a trap, but soon he realized that using the fire to block the gate was meaningless. If there were no men to join in and launch the attack, the fire would be quenched soon by any organized troops. Let alone the fact that the fire had little use to hold back the enemy, since they could bypass the gate and climb the slope to get out. The right tactic was to make the men lie in wait until the scattered fires disturbed the enemy, and then launch an attack and catching them by surprise. It was an effective way to mess up their formation or even force back the enemy. Like he had said before, an unmanned trap was no more than uselessness. At this moment, the other three gates began to smoke too, and the fire in the north gate became clear in sight. What's worse, the fire flared up quickly. It seemed like the gate was stacked with straws to fuel the fire. There were people screeching somewhere in the city, perhaps because their houses caught afire as well. This is not right, the Duke thought. When I entered the city through the north gate, there was nothing to catch a fire there but an open space. But how could the fire spread so quickly without a tinder? Wait. An idea flashed through his mind. Could it be that Garcia Wimbledon had recruited the witches in secret? Francis touched the godstone of retaliation that hung around his neck and felt relieved a little. With the stone that would protect him from evil, he could pass the witch's fire with impunity. Furthermore, no evil harm would come to the guards either, for all of them were equipped with the stones. As for the freemen, who didn't have enough money to contribute to the church, they were beyond the Duke's consideration now. Thinking that the city was a little weird, he decided to get out of the city first. The army could set camp at the south gate. They could watch the city while waiting for the riders of the new king to return. As he thought of it, he commanded the captain, "We move to the south and leave the city. You keep blowing the horn on the way to gather the platoons." Yes. The crowd moved at once. However, when they approached the south gate, the fire had spread to the residential area where acres of houses were burning, casting a heat wave that forced them back. The panicked citizens, who had hidden in their homes, now ran out and crowded the street, even breaking through the wall of blades and swords of guards and running to safe clearings in a fluster. All of a sudden, everyone seemed to sink in the sea of fire, surrounded by the thick smoke and the fierce fire. "Calm down. Go and find the well. Fetch the water to put out the fire." Duke Francis quickly gave a succession of orders. "Let the houses alone. Just try to quench the fire on the blocks and clear out a road. Keep blowing the horn to make sure others know where we are." "Sir." A rider raced from the center of the city and jumped down from the horse before drawing the reins. It was Molière, who was sent to the north gate by the captain. "My lord, there is no way to quench the fire at the north gate." "What did you say?" Francis was in shock. "The fire can't be quenched?" "The fire is fueled by black water," she said quickly. "The fire not only can't be quenched by water but also flows along it." "My lord, the entire north of the city is burning. The flame that can't be quenched," he murmured. "It's the fire of demons indeed." The Duke shouted loudly, "Everyone stay calm. It is the fire of demons set by the witches under Garcia's command. As long as you wear the godstone of retaliation, the seemingly dreadful fire will not harm you." "I see. May God be merciful," said Molière, subconsciously touching her chest. "My lord, what should we do next?" "You've the godstone of retaliation, so what's there to fear? All of you mount your horses, let's race through the fire." the Duke said while waving his hand. "The evil fire will disappear as soon as it meets the God's stone." He paused and said, "Molière, you lead a platoon out first. I will stay here to gather the men yet to arrive." "Yes." The Lady Knight nodded. "Please take care, my lord. The rest of you, be alert and keep up." After that, she mounted and raced to the end of the scorching hot street, without hesitation. Chapter 112, The War of Eagle City Part 3. The knightage of the King City cut into the tail of Garcia's platoon like a sharp silver blade. Panic surged through the crowd of enemies. Many men fell as they were scattering and running in a flurry, ending their lives miserably under the horses' hoofs. Occasionally there were some men that drew their weapons to resist, but they were pierced by the spears of the skilled knights. The one who raced in the front of the unstoppable knights, like the tip of the blade, was Frostwind Knight Namor. The blue-striped cloak flying behind him cast a particular conspicuous sight as he rushed ahead to clear the way. He fought fiercely to force back the enemies, causing his spear to be soaked with blood. Timothy Wimbledon stood on a small slope far away from the battlefield watching the situation. At this moment, the tail of the platoon of 3,000 had become disordered, and as the scattering grew, the platoon almost halted. "They can't hold on much longer," Timothy thought. "Her army will be defeated by 2 more rounds of strikes." The rabble of enemies is no match for the elite knights of Kingdom of Grey Castle. Most of the enemies, who did not even have armor, only needed to be struck once for them to lose fighting capacity. Just as he had expected, the detour took him 2 extra hours. The knightage had gone around Eagle City and then over a col, through a sparse wood, and finally back to the main road. After that, under his command of acceleration, the knights eventually caught up with Garcia's army at noon. According to what the Duke had taught him, Timothy divided the knightage into 3 teams, each with 300 men that would take turns to strike the rear side of the enemy. In this way, he could save enough horses and men to mobilize and support the attack in the event of an emergency. In case of being besieged, rather than marching into the main crowd of the enemy, the knights only needed to be near the platoon from the flank before speeding up and dashing into the platoon. In this way, each time they could cut off a short piece of tail of the enemy's platoon and cost them tens of men. The tactic's effect was obvious. After some rounds of strikes, the enemy had lost over 100 men, and they were unable to fight back. Although they also wanted to organize the riders to defend, they were poorly equipped and trained. Comparing to the knightage of the King's City, their make-do riders were no more than the infantry mounted on horses. When the riders engaged in the battle with the knights, they could not help but to scatter and run away in the bloodshed. The overwhelming slaughter lowered the morale of the enemy immensely. Timothy noticed that some of the men in Garcia's platoon were abandoning the army and running away in other directions. He thought it was time to launch a general offensive. Waiting until Frostwind Knight led the team back, he returned to the knightage from the slope instead of giving the order for the next round of strikes. "Your Majesty, they'll be soon dispersed," Name said as he dried the sweat on his forehead, the blood on his palm leaving some marks. It was the enemy's blood. He had remained unharmed since the battle began. Timothy pulled out his handkerchief and handed it over. "Well done. Take some rest before we launch the last strike." Noticing that the next round of strikes had not come from Timothy's platoon, Garcia's men were aware that the final battle was coming. The large platoon stopped marching and gathered slowly together into an assemblage. The outermost men held up the wooden spears. Seeing their reaction, Timothy scoffed at it. "It is no more than the death struggle. Without any horses and armors, the flesh will never ward off the knightage of King's City but end up in defeat. Whether Garcia was in the platoon will not change the result. Maybe she has run away long ago, leaving her army to buy her more time." But soon he found out that what he had thought was wrong. Once again, the enemy raised the flag of the Queen of Clearwater, letting it fly in the wind. Timothy frowned as he caught sight of the sigil of a sailing ship and crown on the flag. Through the telescope, he watched the enemy. There was a blurred figure of a woman standing on a stage that was made of some warriors. It seemed she was shouting something while raising her hands high. He could not see her face clearly, but he recognized her gray hair. It's Garcia Wimbledon. Why doesn't she run away? Timothy took a deep breath. Very well, in this fashion, the farce will be ended earlier here, saving me the trouble of marching to Port of Clearwater. The new king waited until the horses had enough rest before giving the order of a general offensive attack. Under the leadership of the knightage of the king's city, the 800 riders, which were made of knights and squires, started to march on the enemy. Frost-twinned knight named Moore still raced in the front like the tip of the blade. When the knights were about to charge into the enemy, a large group of riders emerged on the horizon of the east and the west sides. Accompanied with their weird shriek and shout, they galloped all the way to the center of the battlefield. Timothy widened his eyes in disbelief. Who are these people? The troop that burst in had no flag or cannon, and was different from many forces in the kingdom. Watching through the telescope, Timothy found that most of them were without armor and equipped with various weapons. To Timothy's knowledge, only one kind of people had the same sturdy figures and strange faces of theirs. They were from Sand Nation in the southernmost region. There was no need for him to guess which side they stood with. Obviously, Garcia has struck a bargain with Sand Nation so that they'll interfere with the Game of the Thrones of the Kingdom of Grey Castle. Damn foreigners. As Timothy was thinking about this, his rage soared. He turned to shout, "Blow the horn! Call the knights back!" But it was too late for the galloping army to turn around easily. The knightage had rushed into Garcia's platoon, piercing to where the Queen of Clearwater was standing like cutting through butter with a hot knife. Timothy looked at the flying flag eagerly, hoping it would snap and fall down. With the 1,000 soldiers from Sand Nation flanking on each side, the number of Garcia's army is up to 5,000 men, which is beyond the number of my knights. Meanwhile, the soldier from Sand Nation, who is valiant and tough, will threaten the knightage enormously in the close battle. My only chance lies in the possibility that the knights could kill the leader of the enemy and bring down the flag. Yet the flagpole only shook a little and kept standing in the platoon. Once the soldiers from Sand Nation had surrounded their enemy, they marched into the battlefield following the corridor cleared by the knightage. If there were no reinforcements, Garcia's 3,000 desperados would have scattered. Yet, the game had changed. They were holding out and swallowed the knights one by one, like a swamp. The horn calling for the retreat was echoing in the battlefield. One after another, the knights were gathering towards Timothy. However, many men remained trapped within the confines of the enemy's platoon, and Frostwind Knight was one of them. He was panting with the effort to deal with a foreign warrior with a height of almost 3 meters that waved a giant stick to clear away the men around them. With the horse being killed under the bash of the stick, Name now tried his best to dodge the strike. His extraordinary reaction and agility had helped him a lot, but yet the thick, heavy armor wore him out quickly. Finally, he tumbled to dodge and was hit right in the chest by the flying stick. The hit was so hard that the plate caved in and the stick was broken into 2 parts. The flying blue cloak fell slowly and disappeared in the crowd. After an hour, the knights who were still standing had lessened. When Timothy saw that the soldiers from Sand Nation turned their eyes to where he was, he gritted his teeth and commanded the army to withdraw. The rest of the army started to retreat to the north. After the battle, there were only 300 men left with the new king, considerably less than the large platoon that had started the war. Chapter 113, An alert. Since the end of the months of demons this year, the western region had multiple sunny days in a row, with only 2 rounds of rain. These nice days made up for the gloomy weather of the past winter. The musty smell in Roland's office had gone. He was able to breathe fresh air now. Sometimes, he could even smell a pleasant, faint scent of flowers in the garden if he opened his window. As the road between the town and Long Song's stronghold had restored its service by now, Roland started to pay particular attention to the development of the stronghold. Based on what he had observed last year, he had expected that after the traffic was back to normal again, merchants from Long Song's stronghold would have come to Border Town to sell daily necessities. However, He had not seen a single merchant from the stronghold to this day. He ordered Lightning to patrol twice a day, as a way of making sure that the town would be well prepared when his enemy came. In the recent week, the First Army had been busy with a comprehensive military maneuver including defense line battling and field attack. The former was relatively easier, as the artillerymen and the flintlock squad only needed to act according to the signals given by Lightning. She would stay up in the sky to observe and would raise different flags to report the target distance to the soldiers when she spotted an enemy. After seeing different signals, the team leaders would give corresponding commands to their soldiers. They would shoot solid shells when the target distance was between 500 to 800 meters and grape shots for enemy forces within 300 meters if the enemy was less than 50 meters away from them. They would directly fire with flintlocks. As for the field attack, it was a key part of Roland's plan. It generally took 3 days to reach the town from Longsong's stronghold by land, so Roland calculated that his enemy would need the same amount of time to flee back to the stronghold when they were defeated. Even if the knights left all the militia and mercenary soldiers behind, they would still need at least 2 days to withdraw. That meant they would have to spend at least one night camping in the wild. Roland planned to order the First Army to secretly follow the enemy on foot and take this chance to launch a surprise attack at them. He would let Lightning monitor the whole process, in case that the First Army got too close to alert the enemy. Meanwhile, cannons and ammunition would be transported by the little town. The First Army soldiers would surround the enemy's battalion at night after they pitched their tents, and the next morning, his soldier would besiege and crush the enemy. It was not a complicated plan, but without radio communication, it was almost impossible to oversee the situation where his army had to be divided into 2 parts to besiege the enemy. Roland had to put a witch in his plan to make up for the communication inconvenience, but he was still not fully confident about this arrangement. Another problem that he faced was the low reserves of gunpowder. Given that the recent comprehensive military exercise did not shoot live ammunition. Instead, the maneuver just focused on training combined actions of the flintlock squad and the artillery squad and coordination between the witch and the First Army. Roland had sent people to Father Fallen Dragon Ridge and Redwater City, hoping to find more saltpeter suppliers. If he failed to replenish the gunpowder stock for the First Army in time, the soldiers could only use the flintlocks as spears after 2 more battles. Roland wrote down his new purchasing plan on a paper, which included saltpeter, grains and seeds. He intended to ask Baraf to send one of his apprentices to the king's city of the Kingdom of Grey Castle, as there were plenty of goods, especially saltpeter. Summer was near. The niter plant of the king's city must be in full operation now. As nobles and wealthy merchants there would consume a huge amount of saltpeter in hot weather. Roland hoped that he could find a long-term supplier who could constantly purvey this gunpowder material for Border Town. Before this, he had already sent 2 of his guards to implement 2 plans respectively, which were calling for witches and seeking seeds. One guard under the guise of a traveler or a merchant went to spread the rumor that Border Town was calling for witches in streets, taverns and black markets. Of course, he would not say that Prince Roland was accepting witches. He would say it was the Witch Cooperation Association who finally found Holy Mountain and welcomed witches to join. The other guard went directly to Port of Clearwater to buy seeds of extraordinary plants from the fjords. If he found some other rare crops, he would also bring the plants and their seeds back to Border Town. Roland gave Scroll the purchasing list he made and asked her to give it to Baraf in the city hall. When Scroll left, he stretched out to relax and wanted to drink some water, but found his cup was empty. When he was to rise and get the kettle, Nightingale had already brought it to him. With a smile on her face, she stood in front of his desk to fill his cup and then put the kettle back. Roland took a sip slowly, feeling really puzzled. Nightingale's attitude has somehow changed. She smiles at me a lot and now even voluntarily serves as a tea girl. Is she suggesting a pay rise to me? She used to sit on the couch and spend the whole afternoon eating her dried fish. Roland had asked Nightingale about her change, but instead of answering him, she had only given him a smile. After that, Roland just let her do what she wanted. An idea suddenly struck him. Is it because of Gwent? If it can really attract and please the people of this era that much, I should build a chess and card center offering poker games and mahjong later. It'll definitely bring me considerable profits. No, stop. It's not the time to enjoy my life yet. Roland shook his head to banish those thoughts and focused on what he was going to do after he seized the stronghold. He had thought for a long time whether he needed to relocate to Longsong's stronghold. Moving the capital to a more prosperous place seemed very enticing, but might not be a good choice in this case. Unlike Border Town, the stronghold had a history of over 100 years. There were many nobles, making the situation quite complicated. In a feudal system, each domain was controlled by its own lord. Under such circumstances, even the lord of the stronghold could hardly have a say in the domains of his subordinate nobles. If Roland wanted to make the stronghold his own, he needed a radical revolution. He thought he had better not move to the stronghold where fish swam with dragons and where he could not even guarantee his own safety. He did not want to get shot by arrows in the back when he was taking a walk on a street there. Border Town, however, was completely under his own control. It also offered him a vast territory, saving him the trouble of expanding his domain. Most residents of the town were miners and hunters, making the situation quite simple. With his success during the months of demons, he had won wide recognition among the people here. More importantly, most of his subjects had already accepted the witches due to the propaganda of the First Army. Compared with Longsong's stronghold and the other cities which were heavily influenced by the church, it was easier for him to develop the town into a home for both ordinary people and witches. After careful consideration, Roland decided to make Border Town the central area of his domain. As for the stronghold, he could appoint an agent and let him manage the place for him, as long as the agent could offer him workforce and taxes that he needed most right now. Roland had an initial plan to use Longsong's stronghold's wealth to hire its people for the development of Border Town. He conceived to return the gold royals he got from the defeated nobles to the people of the stronghold, and then he would collect taxes through the stronghold government and spend them again. Besides, he also decided to carry out some favorable policies to attract people with desired skills to settle down in Border Town. That was a general frame of his plan. He would not have time to consider the details of the plan, such as how to appoint and supervise an agent, and how to make specific tax policies, until the end of the upcoming battle. At the moment, a golden figure dashed into the room through the window and landed steadily in front of the prince's desk. That was Lightning. "Drink some water first." Roland gave her a cup of water and said. Lightning picked up the cup but did not have the time to drink. She hurriedly reported to Roland, "Your Highness, they're coming." Chapter 114, The Sound of Thunders. The Alliance army from the stronghold was marching steadily toward Border Town. A knightage formed by the knights from the 6 big families of the stronghold was leading the army. Inequality of power among the families could easily be seen from the armors and outfits of their knights. Duke Ryan's knights were certainly the most eye-catching ones. With a significant air, they all rode on short-tailed horses imported from the king's city. These horses were good at long-distance races and looked much taller and stronger than the other ones. The knights wore unified, shining armors that were specially made by Hammer and Dragon Tooth blacksmith's shop. A huge lion head was carved into the thick chest armor and a wolf head into each shoulder armor. The lifelike animal heads seemed to be roaring with their mouths wide open. There were also fine patterns on their cloaks and red silk belts around their waists. Duke Ryan's knights did not only have the look. Each of them had indeed accumulated lots of battling experiences. They had to wipe out the remaining demonic beasts out of the city every year after the months of demons, as a way of ensuring smooth land traffic. In terms of personal fighting skills, they were as good as the members of the knightage of the king's city. They were only less in number, compared with the king's knightage. However, for a duke, it was already a huge expenditure to support such an elite knightage of 150 members. Looking at this elite troop, Duke Ryan was satisfied and absolutely confident that with them, and he would be invincible in the western region. The mercenary fighters were walking casually behind the knightage. They were poorly equipped compared with the knights. Most of them wore old and incomplete chain mails or plate armors. Some had no hand protectors and some no helmets. They carried various kinds of weapons, walking and laughing loudly in groups of 2 or 3. They seemed to be going for a spring outing instead of a battle. Some free civilians were also press-ganged into the army by the Lord. They were plodding on slowly after the mercenary fighters, dragging single-wheel carts filled with foods and tent parts. Due to the speed differences, this army of 1,500 people marched in a really long procession. The knights in the front of the line had to stop every now and then to wait for the troops behind them. My lord, Heartemud, Earl of the Elk family, pulled the rein to catch up with the Duke and said, "We're going to arrive at Border Town in less than half a day. If things go smoothly, we'll get there at 4 p.m. Are we going to rest for a night and reorganize the army for the battle next morning or directly launch an attack against the Lord's castle? Do you want to sleep in the wild again?" The Duke smiled and said, "Tonight, we should lie in beds in the castle instead of the damp earth. Of course, as a courtesy to a royal prince, I'll send a messenger to persuade him first when we arrive at Border Town." Earl Honeysuckle, who was slightly ahead of them, turned around to join the discussion. "Our knights have been traveling all day. They and their horses are both tired now. Is it appropriate to launch an attack under such circumstances? We'd better be careful. After all, Roland Wimbledon successfully survived the months of demons with just his miners. Ha ha, my old friend. I don't know others, but even you don't know the demonic beasts. They're indeed dreadful opponents in the wild, as they're incredibly fast and powerful, but they'll become easy targets when they're blocked out by a city wall. Demonic beasts are just beasts after all." Hearing this, the Earl of the Elk family shrugged and added, "Yes, I agree. Though the prince really surprised me by building a city wall so fast, my knights are not dumb beasts who'll be stopped by a wall." "Exactly, and I've received a piece of news from the north. Hermes nearly fell into ruins, as a huge amount of demonic hybrid beasts attacked Holy City this year for some unknown reason. That means, most of the demonic beasts aimed at Hermes, and only a few of them came to the western region," Duke Ryan said casually. After the western region was under his total control, he did not want to confine himself to this remote area anymore. He placed informants who constantly provided him with the most recent news in all the major cities and towns. For him, the bloody battles against demonic beasts in the northern region were not as important as another war depicted in a secret report from Palisade City. According to the report, Timothy, the new king, and Garcia, Queen of Clearwater, had already fought a fierce battle in Eagle City, but based on the previous information he had got, Timothy's army should arrive at Eagle City a month later. The report did not mention the process of the war, but described the situation of Timothy and that of Eagle City when the new king had retreated from Palisade City. Timothy, who had led an army of thousands of people to the war, had left the city with only a few of his soldiers. He had not even been able to block roads again. At the same time, Eagle City had been caught in the fire. Raging flames had lit up the sky, and black smoke sprang up to reach the clouds. The residents of the surrounding cities and towns had all witnessed the scene. No matter whether the Queen of Clearwater had survived the war or not, Timothy had apparently suffered a heavy loss and a great shock. Stirred by the news, on the same day he had received the secret report, Duke Ryan had sent out his trusted men to the King's City and the eastern region, hoping to find out the current situation of Timothy. If this war between the new king and the Queen of Clearwater truly shattered the Timothy regime, he would not hesitate to add fuel to the fire. This was definitely the best chance for him to declare independence and become a king himself. The northern region had seen many of its soldiers buried near the Holy City during the fighting against demonic beasts. The south needed time to recuperate after the recent war. As for the eastern region and the King's City, if what the secret report had said was true, Timothy would also need several years to recover. At this moment, If he could conquer the northern region and draw some nobles over to join his side, he would be able to split Kingdom of Grey Castle. When that happened, he was going to build his own kingdom which would be as large and populous as Kingdom of Everwinter in the north and be able to compete with the remaining southern and eastern regions of Kingdom of Grey Castle. As to him, Osmond Ryan would become the first king of this new kingdom. The Duke smiled in satisfaction at this thought. He hoped that he could end this farce quickly today and head home tomorrow, bringing the prince as a captive. With any luck, he would be able to receive good news from his informants in his own castle 3 days later. When the sun was almost sinking down into the mountains, Ryan saw a vague silhouette of Border Town, and a dense crowd of people outside it. "Father and your grace, those people seem to be Prince Roland's guards with weapons in their hands. It doesn't look like a welcome." Renamid, who was in charge of guiding the army in the front, hurried back and reported, "It's good, at least we don't have to go to the castle to invite him out," Earl of the Elk family said while smiling. "Tell the knights to slow down. We still have a long way to go before the charge." "Yes, father." Renee received the order and left. Duke Ryan raised a telescope in front of his eye to look at the prince's guards. They were in a strange formation, standing densely in 2 rows and carrying weird weapons in their hands. Those weapons looked like pikes without pointed metal heads and their handles seemed too short. It just did not make sense to the Duke that the prince arranged his guards in this formation. Such a thin, weak defense line would be easily broken through when knights charged toward it. Seeing that, the Duke thought in bewilderment. Even if the prince has no military knowledge, why did his knights and guards just let him mess things up? In order to make sure what the prince was planning, the Duke decided after a thought to order the mercenary fighters to charge in the beginning of the battle, and the knights to wait for order in the charge distance. As he had promised before, he needed to send a messenger to persuade Roland first. Duke Ryan sent for a guard and said to him, "You go to tell the prince that I don't mean to hurt him. It's only the order from King Timothy Wimbledon. If he surrenders to me now, he won't be harmed. I'll escort him back to King's City." It took time for a large army to assemble. When the knights were taking up their positions one after another on both sides, the mercenary fighters were still slowly heading for the center of front line. Right at the moment, 4 flashes of flame dazed Duke Ryan's eyes, and green smokes rose up after those transitory bright flames. The Duke frowned at this scene, thinking he must be deceived by his eyes. He was about to pick up the telescope to look again when there came a series of loud bangs that sounded like thunders. Chapter 115, Defending Border Town Part 1. Vane immediately saw those well-equipped knights in shiny armors riding on tall horses and steadily moving toward the town when the distant enemy first came into his sight. He gasped at the sight of this scene. There was a knight in the town, who always looked down upon people like him, and now here came nearly 100 of them. Vane felt that his hands started to sweat again, just like what had happened to him when he had stood on top of the city wall fighting against demonic beasts for the first time. This time, he thought that he and his enemy, the noble alliance army of Long Song's stronghold, were at least of his own species. "No, my own species? When did those nobles treat you as an equal?" He spat and mocked himself internally and put those thoughts behind. The Stronghold Coalition came here to capture Border Town and control the North Slope mine area again. More importantly, they even claimed to banish His Highness from the Western region. That was totally unacceptable for all soldiers of the First Army. The soldiers knew from a pre-battle speech made by His Highness yesterday that Timothy Wimbledon, an elder brother of His Highness, had killed King Wimbledon III, the late king, and had seized the throne through scheme and tricks. Vane usually cared nothing about nobles plotting against each other, as he believed it made no difference to him no matter who was the king. However, he thought Duke Ryan, who coveted the domain of His Highness in the current disruption, was really way out of line. Vane had witnessed lots of positive changes that His Highness had brought to the town since he had become the lord here. He also clearly remembered the previous lord, who seemed to be an earl. People in the town had seldom seen him except when he had come out to buy furs with his guards. He had often purchased best quality furs from hunters at low prices and had always been the first one to flee in months of demons, leaving all his subjects in the slums of the stronghold. He had never concerned about the sufferings of people. His Highness was different. Under his governance, the life of the town was obviously getting better for all the locals. The miners could be paid more for more work. His Highness had installed a black machine into the mine of Northern Slope to boost production, but he still attributed the extra output to the miners and increased their personal incomes. The locals of the town, who took part in building city wall or crushing stones in the mine, were all paid timely. No one was starved or froze to death this winter. The biggest change in the town was the militia, now called the First Army. Protected by soldiers, the locals of the town did not have to huddle up in their cold wooden sheds and beg big shots for food in winter. Vaina asked himself secretly, if the prince is banished, will the Duke allow the First Army to exist? He took a deep breath and wiped his hand sweats with his clothes while thinking. No, he won't. The nobles of the stronghold won't give a damn about people of the town. Just like what His Highness has said, only an army of people will fight for people. He lifted his head to look up to the left and saw a black point hovering up in the sky. It could be easily mistaken as a big-headed bird, but actually, it was the firing commander of the artillery squad, Lightning. She flew in the sky to investigate the enemy's movements while well covering herself with trees on both sides of the main road. When she flew back, Vaina noticed that the treetops overhead indeed made it impossible for the people below to see her. That meant, if the witch did not fly to an open place by herself, all the enemy could see were branches of trees when they looked up. 15 minutes ago, Lightning had flown close to border town's defense line to show them a green ribbon. Seeing it, Vaina knew at once that the enemy was within 1,000 meters. Now he must immediately command their artillerymen to get ready for firing. In fact, Vaina did not know how long 1,000 meters was. He only gave orders based on the rules he had learned during the maneuver. He quickly shouted out the correct order, instructing the team to reload cannons and correct angles. 4 mortar teams quickly switched angles of cannons to the third gear and filled the bores with gunpowder and solid shells, thus finishing the whole preparation process. After that, Vaina still felt nervous. His heart had been palpitating all the time since the moment the army had assembled in the afternoon. He had considered himself an experienced leader, as he had fought against demonic beasts on top of the city wall, but today he found that he had still a long way to go before becoming a good team leader like Iron Axe or Brian. Both of them had calmly led their teams to the shooting positions, and he had even sensed a tinge of excitement from Brian's voice just now when he had been giving orders. Even his buddy, Rodney, seemed to be better than him. That made him feel a little depressed. He licked his dry lips and started to search for Lightning again. At the moment, the enemy forces suddenly slowed down. What are they doing? Rodney asked. I don't know. Cat's Claw widened his eyes to look at the enemy. They seem to be adjusting the formation, and their people look quite messy. They're waiting for the troops behind, Jop said with a shaking voice. Knights won't fight alone. They're certainly followed by a large number of people. Oh? How do you know that? Nelson twitched his mouth and asked. I've seen it. One knight will take at least 2 squires and a dozen serfs who carry food, Jop said while counting on his fingers. You see, a Duke of Longsong's stronghold must have at least 100 knights. He has at least 300 people who can fight on horseback other than the earls, viscounts in the stronghold. There are even more. And they've hired many mercenary fighters. Those guys are cold-blooded, professional killers. But there are only 300 of us. Nearly 300 of us. Vaina corrected him silently in his heart, but he actually felt better knowing that someone was even more nervous than him. Only about 270 soldiers of the Flintlock squad were equipped with weapons, due to the insufficient production capacity, a phrase said by His Highness. As a result, the Flintlock squad soldiers without guns were relocated in the mortar teams to carry ammunition for the 4 cannons. The mercenary fighters, they're coming, Jop said in a low voice. Vaina looked up and saw a group of people dressed in various clothes gradually taking the central position in the enemy's formation. They did not ride horses or march in lines. In groups of 2 or 3, they gathered in the center. The knights were moving to the sides, leaving the central space for them. In less than 10 minutes, the alliance army of the dukes had gotten much closer to him again. In a sudden, a knight rapidly galloped out of the army and headed to border town. Vaina's heart skipped a beat at the sight. He almost shouted out the firing order. What's he going to do? Confused as he was, he looked up but still could not see lightning. The knight was getting closer and closer while waving a white flag in his hand. He's the messenger of the Duke. He's probably coming to persuade us to surrender, Jop mumbled. That's none of our business, Rodney said, and then squatted down behind the cannon to align his eye with the central line of the cannon barrel. Sir, the cannon needs to be readjusted, as most of the knights have already left the central part. The soldiers were taught repeatedly during the maneuver when they had conducted solid shell practices that a shell's point of fall was in line with the cannon barrel. Given that, if they wanted to hit their target, they needed to adjust the cannon barrel until its central line aligned with the target. 5 soldiers worked together to move the cannon's carriage a little, so as to aim precisely at the knights in the front of the Alliance army again. The messenger arrived and was brought by His Excellency Carter to the back of the defense line, but Vaina knew clearly that it was only a waste of time, as His Highness would never surrender to the Duke. Right at the moment, lightning put on a burst of speed, flying toward the town with a yellow ribbon in hand. The yellow ribbon flapping in the wind indicated that the enemies were within 800 meters at this distance. They were able to hit targets with solid shells from the cannons. At the meantime, the mortar teams could fire freely as long as the captain of artillerymen did not forbid it. Seeing the signal, Vaina's team members all looked at him. He nodded, took a deep breath and then ordered, "Fire!" Chapter 116, Defending Border Town Part 2. Due to limited physical strength, horses carrying knights could only maintain a high speed in a short time. As a general rule, in a charge, the knights would let their horses trot first when the enemy was around 800 to 1000 meters away. They would speed up once the distance was shortened to 500 meters and sprint for the last 200 meters. Theoretically, the shooting range of a 12-pound Napoleon cannon was 1,300 meters for solid shells, but the cannons designed and made by Roland tended to miss targets over 1,000 meters away, which might result from a small ratio of the barrel caliber to the barrel length. To ensure a high hit ratio, he made it a rule that artillerymen could only fire when an enemy was within 800 meters. In this way, shells would also be very destructive, especially to a crowd of enemies, as they would bounce forward on the ground after landing. As Duke Ryan had ordered mercenary fighters to charge first, all the knights were standing by in a charge distance. This was usually a distance of absolute safety, as the enemy's arrows could never shoot that far. Meanwhile, this distance also gave knights enough space to speed up their horses step by step during a charge. The slow assembling of mercenary fighters made the knights hold their horses to wait in their positions. In this way, they became easy, fixed targets for the mortar teams. By now, the Duke's army had already unknowingly stepped on Roland's planned battleground. They could only see a flat, wide main road in the middle, with green grasslands on both sides, but those seemingly ordinary grasslands were actually full of plants grown by Leaf for special purposes. Hidden in the knee-high grasses, stout vines worked as heel ropes to prevent the knights from swiftly outflanking the First Army from the sides. Within 1,000 meters on this battleground, there were distances marks left by Soraya, which were also invisible to the people on the ground. Up in the sky, however, Lightning could clearly see that the battlefield was split into segments by different color marks. Each colored mark represented a certain distance from the defense line. From above, the enemies seemed to march on a straight ruler. That saved the artillery squad the trouble of calculating and correcting angles by themselves before firing. They just needed to act according to steps that they had learned in their previous maneuver. Vaina's team was the first to fire their 12-pound cannon at the enemies. A gust of air caused by the explosion of gunpowder sent a shell out of the barrel and flying at a speed of over 400 meters per second in the air. In the blink of an eye, it struck the ground with a whistling sound. It passed between two knights and finally fell into the grassland aside. The earth and crushed stones flying in all directions startled the horses. One of the knights had even fallen down from his horse before realizing what had happened. Two following shells also missed their targets. They only created more dust and dirt springing up into the air. In the first round of firing, only the fourth shot of the 4 cannons turned out to be lucky. There had been nothing in front of the iron ball, but then an unlucky knight happened to step into the area where the shell struck. His armors were of no use facing a high-speed iron ball. It broke the thin layer of iron and went through his body. After that, it bounced on the ground, hit and broke another knight's calf and then cut open his horse's tummy. The inner organs of the horse poured all over the ground. The artillerymen would have to readjust for the next round of firing, if the knightage were accelerating their horses. However, the sudden strike apparently shocked the Duke's alliance army. The knights did not receive any order to attack and still stayed in their positions, trying to calm down their frightened mounts. They did not know where those iron balls came from and how they came, as naked eyes could hardly observe objects flying at such a high speed. Vane's team reloaded the cannon as fast as they could to start the second round of shooting. Hot weapon attacks were more than what flesh and blood could bear. Even rubbing against a fast-moving iron ball could severely injure a human body. The knight hit directly by the shell was blown to bits. His blood gushed out, forming clusters of blood mist in the air. The soldiers of the Alliance army could only catch a glimpse of a black item when it bounced on the ground. It looked like a black ghost slaughtering their comrades. After the 2 rounds of attack, the Duke finally linked pieces together. He sank into thought. The flames and the loud sounds must have something to do with the sudden strikes. The enemy forces seem to have some incredible weapons that shoot much farther than crossbow bolts. They may have the same firing range as mangonels of the stronghold. At this thought, the Duke gave the knights the order to charge by having a soldier blow a horn, as he believed that weapons for long-range strikes would not work once the distance was shortened. Hearing the horn, the knights reacted quite differently. Some of them followed the order and quickened their pace, heading for the town. Some were still trying everything to calm down their mounts. A small number of them were even retreating at the moment. The mercenary fighters rushed toward the sides where the knights stood, making the formation in utter disorder. Seeing the knights taking their positions on the main road and getting ready to charge, mortar teams stirred at once. Apart from cleaning bores and reloading cannons, this time, they needed to move the cannon carriages again, as they saw a red ribbon in Lightning's hand when she returned to the sky above the defense line. A red signal meant that the enemy forces were only 500 meters away. That was the cannon's point-blank range. At this distance, they had an 80% hit rate. Vane cried out, "Remain flat. Be quick, fire, fire." He did not even stop to look at the situation of the enemy when deafening noises of explosion died down. Instead, he directly turned around and shouted to the soldiers in charge of distributing ammunition. "Grapeshot. Give me grapeshot." During artillery training, His Highness had emphasized many times that once they saw red signals, they must reload their cannons with grapeshot and fire at the enemy forces when they were within 300 meters. His Highness had also reminded them that they must shoot out all the solid shells in the bore first before reloading grapeshot if their cannon was not empty. Looking like an iron can on the outside, grapeshot was a cylinder stuffed with small iron balls and sawdust. Before the soldiers put the grapeshot in the bore, they needed to reload gunpowder and stuff a thin, wooden board inside the barrel, as grapeshot's diameter was smaller than that of the bore. The moment Lightning raised a purple signal, 4 cannons fired all at once. This was the first time for Vane to shoot real grapeshot. The artillerymen including him had only received training without ignition because His Highness said that it was difficult to collect and reuse grapeshot. Today, he witnessed how destructive it could be for the first time. After the grapeshot flew out of the muzzle, Its iron container violently broke open due to huge pressure differences. The iron balls inside rained on the knights within 300 meters like a downpour. Blood gushed out of the knights and their horses. The grapeshot shot down a crowd of enemies as easily as reaping wheat. Some iron balls could even maintain a high speed after they went through a human body. When that happened, even hiding behind someone else could not save a knight's life. There were still some lucky knights who escaped the iron ball shower and came to the sprint distance. They all lowered their upper bodies and rode forward at the highest speed, with only one thought in mind, which was breaking the weak defense line and killing the cowards who had been hiding behind it and operating those vicious weapons all the time. At their current speed, the knights only need less than 2 minutes to finish this 150-meter sprint. However, it turned to be extremely hard for them to complete this short distance of 150 meters. The last round of grapeshot firing totally destroyed their will to fight. Within 100 meters, the undeformed, high-speed iron balls could go through 2 to 3 people at once. A cone-shaped area in front of each muzzle now was a realm of death. Each of the fastest 20 knights ended up dead. The only difference was how many shots he had got before he fell down. The knightage collapsed. Nothing could save this routed trooper now. The frightened knights in the back of the troop pulled their horses, trying to flee the field. Seeing the knights escaping, mercenary fighters would naturally refuse to move any step forward. They did risk their lives in battles for money, but they never defied death. Now it was apparently the time to flee, and they were running much faster than they had when they had come to the battle. The panic quickly struck the whole of Duke Ryan's army, making the situation out of control. Soldiers pushed their way to flee the battleground. Those people who were knocked down on the ground were stamped to death. Everyone was too busy running away to attend to others, wishing they could grow 2 extra legs. At the same time, guerrilla song rang on the battleground. Bordentown's infantry marched out in lines to clean the field. Chapter 117, The Pursue and Attack Part 1. This was the first time for Carter Lannis to see such a battle. A large team composed of 300 knights was already devastated without even scratching the edge of their defense line. Even at the end, they were not able to enter the 50-meter zone. Prince Roland marked it as the flintlock squad shooting line. Everyone was only allowed to fire when the enemy crossed the 50-meter line. The 4 cannons forced the enemies to dwell at the 100-meter line mark. In the zone between 100 meters to 150 meters, there were about 20 corpses lying on the ground, who, just like Carter, were all skillful knights. Had they not have been skillful knights, they would not have been able to advance at high speed on their horse among the blistering gunfire. Carter was glad that he was not one of those sacrificed knights. He vaguely felt that the wars in the future would be distinctly different than the ones before. Roland Wimbledon, who held such formidable power, would inherit the throne sooner or later. Some men of the First Army were experiencing dizziness and nausea after seeing such horrifying battle scenes. Since it was not close combat, the impact of killing enemies with cannon would be much less than killing enemies with their own hands. Therefore, the reactions were not too severe. Carter picked a group of hunters who used to see blood and stumps, and ordered them to collect the corpses and search for any surviving men. The sun gradually fell into the mountains and Carter stared at the blood-red sky, listening to the humming of crows from the faraway woods. He suddenly felt a sense of forlornness. The era of the night was over. Duke Ryan was still in a state of bafflement. He could not understand how they lost. That defense line seemed so vulnerable, as if it would be penetrated by one light stab. However, the knights fled as though they had seen demons. He could not even blame the others because the ones in the forefront of the troop were his most elite knights. The guards chopped down several people to divert the swarming mercenaries from the Duke's location. However, that was all he could do. No matter how he shouted, he could not control his deviated subordinates. Without any choice, Duke Ryan had to retreat about 10 miles with the crowd. Once night had fallen, the Duke chose a place near the river to set up base camp. The separated knights and mercenaries approached under torchlight. There were still many lost members, and the worst part was that the freedmen left carts and food when they retreated. The Duke and the other members had to kill a couple of horses for food. In the largest tent, the nobles from 5 prominent families gathered together. They looked at Duke Ryan with ghastly pale faces. Duke Ryan was carrying a solemn expression himself. "Who can tell me what weapon they're using?" The distance was farther than crossbow bolts could reach, but it was unlike the mangonel from which we could see the stones being tossed. He glanced at René Madg. "You were moving in the front line, did you see anything?" "My lord, I'm not so sure," René answered, holding his head. "I could only hear the gunfire, and then the knights collapsed group by group. Especially the last fire, it looked like the knight who was racing at the forefront bumped into an invisible wall. I saw his body shaking, and his head and limbs were scattered, just like—" He thought for a moment. "An egg that was thrown off from the top of the castle. Perhaps it was witches?" The Earl of the Elk family mumbled. "Impossible." The Duke frowned. "All my knights were wearing the God's Stone of Retaliation. Witches won't be able to hurt them. You've played with witches before. They're like ordinary girls in front of the God's Stone." "Oh, yes, my lord." René suddenly recalled something. "After hearing that loud noise, I saw that they had a few carts in their troop. There were big iron tubes on the cart, and I could see red lights and smoke rising from it." "Iron tubes? Red lights and smoke? Isn't that a ceremonial barrel?" the Earl of the Elk family questioned. The Duke, of course, knew what a ceremonial barrel was. It was often used in huge ceremonies for nobles in the king's city. Now the lord of every district would have a couple for spare use. He had a couple of barrels in his castle. It would blast after putting in snow powder. However, its noise was incomparable to the thundering roar he heard today. "Ceremonial barrels won't split knights into pieces," Honeysuckle Earl said, "and no matter what weapon the prince used, we've already lost the war. What shall we do next?" Duke Ryan glanced at him with displeasure. The word lose sounded ear-piercing to him. "We've not lost yet." He strengthened. "One battle wouldn't alter the result. Once we get back to the stronghold, I can summon another troop and at the same time terminate the business on the Redwater River. Without food, Border Town won't last for a month. As soon as he brings those peasants out, my knights will devastate and flank him from the back. Victory will belong to me," he thought. "However, the loss that has been suffered isn't comparable to a small town. It'll be impossible to reconquer the Northern Territory. Damn it. If I caught Roland Wimbledon, I'd cut him into pieces." "But my lord, the ship on Redwater River was not only from Longsong's stronghold but also from Willow Town, Fallen Dragon Ridge, and Redwater City. If we terminate them all, would we?" Honeysuckle Earl hesitated. "I'll buy it all." "Nothing matters as long as I pay the money," the Duke said coldly. "You shall all return to your tent and rest. We'll depart at dawn. Knights with horses shall come with us. The ones without horses will stay back to lead the mercenaries. They could not march at night. Even if Prince Roland wanted to pursue and attack, he would have to wait until dawn. The prince would first encounter the mercenaries that moved behind his group. He thought, even if these useless ones collapsed quickly, it would at least buy some time for me." The next morning, the Duke did not receive any news to indicate that the prince would pursue. To confirm this information, the Duke sent out his trusted followers to enlarge the investigation zone. They all returned with the same information. This was a great relief to him. Perhaps those new weapons were cumbersome to move like the mangonel and could only be used in defensive battles. Prince Roland would not act carelessly by relying on a bunch of miners. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the Duke ordered the knights to stop the march and to wait for the others to follow them. The mercenaries and freedmen were only able to catch up with the knights at dusk. The crowd fumbled and made an area for base camp. The Duke would reach Longsong's stronghold after surviving through the night. The 10-meter city wall was like the natural moat to the hundreds of person troop. Even if Roland had the new weapon that could shoot over a long range, the Duke would retaliate with the mangonel from the wall. It was the time for the Duke to retaliate. However, all day long, Duke Ryan felt as if he was being watched, which made him a little comfortable. Perhaps it's just a delusion, I'm too nervous, the Duke thought. The next day at dawn, the Duke was awoken by the roars of gunfire. He rushed out of the tent and found that everyone was fleeing. There was splattering dirt and blood everywhere. The Duke looked to the west side and saw that the militia that was wearing leather armor was in a straight line and standing outside of the camp. In the deafening roars of gunfire, the Duke had only one thought in his mind: how did they catch up with them? Why did not the knights find those pursuers yesterday? My lord, we have to run. The guard brought a horse and shouted. Osman Ryan finally came to reality from his bewilderment. He jumped onto the horse and ran to the east with the guards. However, they encountered another troop soon after they left the camp. Wearing the same leather armors and holding weird truncheons in their hands, they neatly lined up and even wore the same expression. Soon, the Duke heard rhythmic sounds from the opposite side. With orderly pace, Prince Roland's troop marched toward him. Chapter 118, The Pursue and Attack Part 2. Roland ordered the First Army to practice at least twice a week, but they never tried to march at night. Marching at night would be dangerous. They would be easily attacked by wild beasts and snakes without being able to see the road clearly. Besides, it would be easy to lose bearing and get lost, while torchlight would attract wild beasts. That was why Roland had to wait until the next day at dawn to have the troop march and follow the Duke's army. To ensure the success of this plan, Prince Roland decided to follow the First Army in person. Of course, he chose to stay on the little town instead of riding horses on bumpy roads. After a half-month of training, Hummingbird could already stabilize timing for light fraction conversion of the 12-pound cannon. Considering a longer enchantment process, Roland ordered Hummingbird to convert the cannons at dawn. He hoped that the first cannon would take the longest time for conversion and the time would gradually lessen with each subsequent cannon. Benefiting from Hummingbird's ability, the little town could load 4 cannons and all the mortar team members on a trip. The large concrete boat was occupied by people. Besides the cannon team and Roland, the rest of the members on the boat were Anna, Nightingale, Nana, Leaf, Echo, Hummingbird, Porcupine and Wendy, who was responsible for providing the power, along with Brian, who was working as the captain. It could be said that except those not good at combat such as Scroll, Soraya, Lily, and Mystery Moon, almost all the witches in Border Town participated in. Initially, Anna did not need to fight on the battlefield. However, Roland could not refuse when he saw the determination in Anna's eyes. The Land Army was the flintlock troop of the First Army and was directed by the Chief Knight Carter and Iron Axe. Lightning took responsibility for locating and tracking. The group of people quietly followed the enemies. Their distance was outside of the investigation zone of the enemy's scouts. Once Lightning found any activities of the scouts, the troop would stop marching. They captured many lost mercenaries and freedmen along the way. However, they could not deal with these surrendered enemies, and so Roland had them disarmed and brought them along. It was the first time that Roland had led a huge army to conquer the enemy. Standing at the front of the little town and feeling the wind that was blowing on his face, Roland felt quite motivated. "What makes you so happy?" Anna suddenly appeared beside him and asked. Roland took back his smile. "Nothing at all." "Really?" Anna handed her handkerchief to Roland. "Wipe your saliva." Roland suddenly felt a compulsion to jump into a river. "Thanks." It was already sunset when Lightning reported that the enemy had set up its base camp. Compared with the relentless investigations when coming, the coalition was demoralized heavily after such a total defeat. The moment it was just sunset, the scouting knights ran back to the camp, afraid to miss the horse meet at night. Roland's troop camped beside the lake 2 kilometers away from the Duke's army. They were not discovered, so the annihilation plan was already halfway successful. Next, they only had to wait to besiege the enemy before their departure. This was the first time that Roland had camped overnight in the wild. Compared with the camp that was full of insects, he would rather choose to sleep on the boat. The wooden shed where cannons were placed was emptied, and the members of the mortar team took the 12-pound cannons off to rest in the camp. The little town became the temporary palace for the prince. Except Roland, all the other witches would also sleep over on the boat. Everyone covered the tent with blankets and lay down side by side. Roland wanted to avoid the situation. However, he found that the witches paid no attention at all. Except Anna, they had all experienced some degree of hardship. In the days of wandering, it was normal to spend a night in the wilderness. Soon, everyone fell asleep except Roland and Anna, who found themselves sleepless. The former was because he was used to a soft bed and was unaccustomed to a hard bunk bed, but the latter, with her unknown thoughts, was staring at Roland. Every time the prince turned his head, Anna would close her eyes immediately and pretend that she was asleep. However, against the moonlight, her eyelashes were shaking slightly. If Roland was not afraid to disturb the others, he really wanted to pinch Anna's small nose, force her to open her eyes and hug her in his arms. It was a sleepless night for both of them. It was not yet dawn, but Roland had already started his annihilation plan. 270 infantries with flintlocks would be separated into two teams. One of the teams would take 2 cannons to the backside of the Duke's army through the little town and finish the defense line from 1 kilometer away. Lightning was responsible for monitoring the movements of the Duke. After the cannons were set up, she would make signals, and the other team, led by Carter, which would launch an attack from the front. The unified transportation by concrete boat avoided the possibility of separation. After Nightingale went into the mist, her black and white view could be used as a night vision appliance. As the pilot, she could help the little town to sail at night. After they practiced the process many times, everyone knew their responsibilities very well. Wendy boosted the wind power so that the little town was able to transport all the members to the backside smoothly. After 2 hours, the interception team led by Iron Axe was all set. Then lightning flew to the top of Carter's camp and showed an orange flag. It was just dawn. The annihilation plan had just begun. Because Echo was assigned to the backside, the members of the Flintlock team who were assigned to attack in the front did not need to move. All they had to do was to line up and protect the 2 cannons. The 12-pound cannons were pushed onto the battlefield and were fired toward the enemy's camp. At this time, the Duke's army was still asleep. With the roaring noise of cannons, the solid shells went straight to the enemy's camp. The knights and mercenaries, who just now realized the situation, rushed out of the tents, but to find that the First Army had already lined up and was waiting. With the previous disastrous experience, no one dared to challenge this seemingly weak defensive line, and all fled to the east. However, Iron Axe had been waiting in the backside for a long time. When enemies appeared, it was finally the closing time for this annihilation plan. With the reverberating marching music, the 150 members of the First Army lined up to impose pressure on the Duke's army. The enemies would have soon abandoned their mounts and fled through the forest. Duke Ryan was in a state of desperation. He could not understand how Roland's army appeared behind them. Recognize the failure and surrender? He did not know how Roland Wimbledon would treat a duke that dared to attack the royal family. Perhaps he would be imprisoned or exiled, or more likely sent to the scaffold. Regardless of the choices, Long Song's stronghold would have nothing to do with him. Roland's troop came closer and closer to him, so did Roland's formidable weapon that roared and shone from time to time. The Duke knew that if he did not run now, he would not have the chance anymore. He only had 30 members left with him, and this was his last resort. "They couldn't stop us with their small troop," Duke shouted, "and as long as we cross over that line, they won't catch us without any transportation means. It would only take us half a day to arrive Long Song's stronghold. My knights, follow me." Then Duke started to command the mount to enhance its speed. However, not everyone had the mindset to fight regardless of their lives. He had only 10 people including his guards with him, but he could not care too much at this point. The marching music suddenly stopped. Roland's troops stopped their march in a good order and stood before the Duke like a wall. Then the Duke saw the troop raise their short wooden sticks. When Duke was only 100 steps away from the defensive wall, a range of noises blasted. He felt a shock on his breast and his stomach as if he was stricken by a massive hammer. Then he felt a feeling of paralysis and powerlessness. He leaned backward and fell from his horse to the ground. The Duke wanted to say something but could not make any noise. He coughed and smelled a strong scent of blood. The sticky liquid blocked his throat. Soon, darkness engulfed him. Chapter 119, The Ransom Part 1. Petrov Hull sat at the desk and subconsciously fiddled with an exquisite parchment. That was the program the Long Song Theatre sent on every weekend afternoon. Usually, he would have chosen a favorite play and let the housekeeper pay the deposit, before giving the invitation to Shirley. But now he did not read a single word. 7 days had passed since their departure. If everything went smoothly, father should have already returned yesterday with the Duke. Perhaps there was a delay on the road. Or perhaps the people were tired, and rested an extra day in bordered town? He tried to comfort himself, but yet he grew more anxious. Prince Roland of Wimbledon left a deep impression on him. Petrov felt it was incredulous. How could such an outstanding prince have such a bad reputation in the king's city? People commented that he had a bad character and was dandy, incompetent and ignorant. None of these evaluations tallied with the prince he knew. But this was exactly why he felt so uneasy. He was afraid that the Duke would lose to him. "Master Petrov," shouted the housekeeper at the door. "There's a letter from Long Song's stronghold." Petrov was dazed for a second. "Bring it in quickly." After opening the cover, the first word in the letter already left Petrov stunned. It was a letter written by Prince Roland. "Duke Osman Ryan attacked my territory with force and tried to start a rebellion. The Duke himself was already executed on the battlefield, and Long Song's stronghold is now back under my rule." His heart sank, and then he continued reading. Duke Ryan's accomplices, other than a few die-hard rebels, had already surrendered and pleaded guilty. The families who rebelled against royal family were supposed to be executed as well, but I have been merciful. Only the main ones involved would be sentenced to death and the rest of the captives could be redeemed with money. The place to carry out the exchange would be at the Lord's Castle in Long Song's stronghold. The list is as follows. This official letter was written in an awkward manner, without using the diplomatic language, but the meaning was loud and clear. The Duke had failed in his rebellion and the prisoners could be redeemed with money. Petrov lowered his eyes to find his father's name appear in the first line. "Hadi!" He shouted the name of the housekeeper. "Prepare the carriage. I'm going to the Lord's Castle in Long Song's stronghold." Earl Honeysuckle's territory was in the east of Long Song's stronghold. When Petrov rushed to the castle's area, it was already half an hour later. The Lord's Castle was filled with the militia he had never seen. They had no shiny armor and no cloak or ribbon. Each held a peculiar short stick in the hand with a sharp bayonet at the top. They stood neatly in 2 rows, with their head held high. Petrov could feel their undeniable presence. After reporting his identity, Petrov was given access to the garden, and then led by a guard to the castle hall. He had come to this place many times, but today, he felt like he had stepped into a completely foreign territory. The guards on the aisle were all new faces. No one nodded or smiled at him, but just looked at him blankly. At the entrance of the hall, a knight came up toward him. "What's your name?" "Petrov Hull," he replied with a slight displeasure. He did not like the interrogative dialogue and therefore emphasized his name a second time. "Sir Hull." "Oh." The other party looked disbelievingly. He looked over the list. "Earl Shalafi Hull is your father. Please accept my apologies," the knight said without changing his expression. "I'm Kartalanis, Prince Roland's chief knight. Please come to the side room so that we can check if you have any weapons." After the search, his godstone of retaliation was also removed by the guard. "That's not a weapon," Petrov said. "Of course not." The knight nodded. "After the meeting, we'll return it to you. You can rest assured." He opened his mouth but finally decided against speaking. "Return it to me?" That god stone of retaliation stone is considered a top-grade stone and is worth at least 50 gold royals. It'll certainly be replaced by a defective one when they return it. Forget it, he thought. As he walked into the hall, he saw Prince Roland writing on his seat. He raised his head and was startled to see Petrov, but then he laughed. "We meet again, Mr. Ambassador." It was still his familiar face and tone. Petrov started to relax a little, bowed and saluted. "Greetings to you, Your Highness. Have a seat." Roland lifted his hand to direct him to his seat. "I'm sure you're aware of what has happened. Your father was not hurt. He was one of the first that surrendered." "Thanks for your kindness, Your Highness," said Petrov. "I'm not sure how much ransom is required. As long as Honeysuckle can afford it, I'll arrange them to send the money immediately." "I don't need money." Roland shook his finger. "I want livestock and men." It was normal to want livestock. In the last 50 years, the conflict between the lords was usually settled with the losers compensating with cattle and sheep. Petrov had read this more than once in books. "Why did Prince Roland request for men?" "Your Highness, the Honeysuckle domain does have a lot of cattle, sheep, and horses, but as for men, it's very simple. Masons, carpenters, farmers, serfs are all useful to me." The prince handed over a paper roll. "You can follow the values here, as long as the total numbers add up to 3,000. He smiled. "By the way, because the Earl can be considered as the one with the largest title, so his value is also the highest." Petrov spread the roll of paper on the table. He saw that it was listed with occupational categories and livestock species, followed by a number, cattle 3, sheep 2, mason 10 and the like. He understood immediately what the prince meant. The value of 3,000 meant that he needed to pay 1,000 cattle or 300 masons to redeem his father. Of course, his territory did not have so many cattle or masons. Arranging the items on the paper into different groups would produce a variety of options. As a noble that dealt daily in trade, Petrov was instantly aware that there was a lot of maneuvering he could do. He just needed a few days to calculate an optimal solution that had the smallest cost to meet the requirements of 3,000 points. "Your Highness, could I?" "1 day, I can only give you 1 day." Roland stretched out a finger. "This refers only to the time for you to make a choice. After all, it would take 3 or 4 days to gather so many resources and people. And I won't stay here forever. I'll leave after a week at the most." "A day is really—" Petrov was taken aback suddenly and stared with his eyes wide open at the prince. "Hang on, did you say that you wanted to leave?" He fell into thoughts. What does this mean? If the letter was correct, the Duke died on the battlefield. Long Song's stronghold now belongs to His Highness, yet he actually wanted to leave. Is this place less significant than the small and broken bordered town? No, this isn't the main point. The point is, if His Highness departed, who'll run this magnificent city? His heart became tumultuous. He knew very well this would be impossible. That'll give the Duke's children an opportunity to gather troops to avenge their father? Would he consider the 5 families aside from the Ryan family or the other noble families? "Yes," said Roland, "I'll take the ransom and return to Border Town." His heart was suddenly filled with a thought, and once this idea appeared, it could no longer be suppressed. "Your Highness," said Petrov in a low voice, after swallowing hard, "excuse me, is there also a numerical value to redeem Long Song Stronghold?" Chapter 120, The Ransom Part 2. Roland stared at Petrov with a look of interest and laughed. "You're the first person to ask me that," he said. He took the cup and had a sip, and then said in a casual tone, "Long Song's stronghold is undoubtedly mine, even if I'm not here. What I really need is a person or a family to run Long Song's stronghold on my behalf. Therefore, what you should ask me isn't the ransom, but the agency fees." Agency. Petrov was no stranger to this word. Many of the nobles had no time or interest in trade, while they had large output in their domain. Some sharp-sighted businessmen would help them to sell goods. In order to obtain this right from the noble, The businessman had to pay a sum of money in advance as a deposit. How many pieces of gold royals would you require? He took a deep breath and tried to calm himself down. This is a long process, so you don't have to pay it all at once. Roland paused, and then said, 30% of the monthly tax of Longsong Stronghold, as well as supplies which value 1,000 points. The rest belongs to you. It was not that outrageous, Petrov thought. As long as he could control Longsong's stronghold completely, this price was even reasonable. He confirmed that His Highness was not kidding. The prince really intended to keep his word. This was an once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, Petrov thought to himself. He and the prince were not enemies. The duke has completely failed, and his children would be deprived of their inheritance. If the coalition forces could not defeat the prince, then who could stop him from controlling the western region? Aligning themselves with more powerful forces was the basic principle for the continuation of the noble. If he could earn His Highness' trust before the other four families, then Honeysuckle would own the biggest domain in the western region. Your Highness, why don't you wish to stay here? This castle is larger than the one at Border Town. What you meant to ask was why I wouldn't run Longsong's stronghold myself. Roland looked at the slightly embarrassed Petrov and laughed. There are many reasons. The power struggle here is too complicated, and straightening out the relationships takes too much time, much less getting some profit from it. Supporting a local noble family who can govern better than me is a win-win deal. There are many other reasons that you can think about slowly. The prince started playing with the silver cup. By the way, if you were chosen as the agent, would you try to revenge the duke? Of course not, Your Highness. Although the question was a little unexpected, Petrov still replied immediately. The duke was already gone. The five families now need to think about how to carve up his territory. Who would still care about revenge? Thought Petrov. However, Petrov also knew that these were not the real reasons why His Highness did not want to stay in Longsong's stronghold. The power struggle is too complex and difficult to straighten out. With his oppressing power, he absolutely can exterminate the opposing forces in the span of 1 to 2 years. All the nobles would forget the loser Ryan, just like what Ryan did in the past. Yet 2 years isn't enough to construct Border Town into such a big city like Longsong Stronghold. In that case, this city. I'd gladly be your agent, Your Highness. Petrov blurted out. Yet he soon seemed hesitant. But, the king, no, I mean your elder brother, might not agree with this result. If he arranges a new duke for the western region, I would be unable to oppose the king's city. You don't need to oppose them. Roland threw 2 letters before him. Look at this, and the document I found in Duke Ryan's office. Petrov quickly scanned the contents of the letter, and could not help but gasp. The first seal looked like a secret letter. The new King Timothy and Queen of Clearwater had a battle in Eagle City and suffered a major failure. The content of the second letter was even more horrifying. The document was only half written but stated Duke Ryan wanted to annex the north. His intention to be an independent king was revealed clearly on paper. The letter was not complete, hence it was impossible to know who the intended recipient was. He understood His Highness's intentions. No resistance was needed because the new king was already at hard times himself. Otherwise, the duke would certainly not want to be independent. His elite knights were enough to wipe out the western region, but still a far cry from the knightage of the king's city. A secret letter may be forged, but this document is indeed in Osmond Ryan's handwriting. Unless the prince finds a witch that can imitate another man's writing, he thought, and then denied the speculation. The prince doesn't need to go to so much trouble to deceive me. Acting as the agent for Longsong's stronghold isn't a unilateral transaction. If I can't establish a firm foothold in Longsong's stronghold, His Highness won't also stand to gain. Moreover, the duke designated by Timothy is bound to be the enemy of Prince Roland. If the Honeysuckle family wanted to override the other 4 big families, then I would have to rely on the support of the prince. On the contrary, in order to ensure my interests to be better protected, the prince should also help the Hull family to hold the position more firmly. As soon as he thought of this, Petrov stood up slowly and bowed to Roland. "The whole family is at your service." "Well." The latter nodded. "At the moment it's still undecided if you should be the agent. Let me first ask you a few questions." "Please go ahead, Your Highness." "How are you going to deal with those forces against you? What's your estimate of the monthly taxes? How are you going to guarantee to provide supplies which value 1,000 points? What measures do you have if I ask you to develop the business on a large scale?" Petrov thought that His Highness just wanted to take this opportunity to get some information about the noble in the western region. He did not expect the latter to ask such strange questions as if he were being assessed for his administrative or general business knowledge. A series of questions followed and Petrov racked his brains to answer them one by one. His Highness looked more and more impressed with each answer. In the end, he clapped his hands and said, "Yes, we'll stop here today. When you've put together the ransom valuing 3,000 points, you can return to redeem the Earl. Rest assured, he'll be well taken care of these days. Your Highness, about the agent rights. It'll be announced on that day." Roland implied that it was time for the knight to escort the guest out. Petrov left the hall with mixed emotions. He then saw Carter returning to him the god's stone of retaliation. It was still blue and translucent, and worth 50 gold royals. "So what did you think?" Roland looked at Nightingale, who had emerged from the side. "Well, he said more or less the truth." She shrugged her shoulders and said, "He was much more sincere than the ones interviewed before him. By the way, do you really think that it's a good idea for you to repeat the same things to everyone? What about those letters? Aren't the contents supposed to be of the utmost secrecy?" "Not everyone." The prince looked over the list and said, "They're from the 5 big families. These great nobles are the only ones suitable for managing Long Song's stronghold. For those that aren't strong enough, even if they were to get this position, they wouldn't be able to run Long Song's stronghold properly. Instead, this would only cause the various forces to start an endless internal strife among themselves. As for Timothy Wimbledon being defeated at Eagle City, that isn't really a big secret. It would soon spread throughout the whole kingdom of Grey Castle. I was just trying to speed up the process." He thought, if the second prince did not suffer such a defeat, it would probably be much harder to recruit an agent. If the use of coercion was needed, the results would not be so perfect. "So, have you already decided to choose him?" "If all goes as planned," said Roland with a smile. Anyway, he was the first person to take the initiative to ask about this matter. A subjective initiative has always been the most important quality of a staff. "I did not expect to discover among the 5 families such a talent who's proficient in administration and trade. I thought they were only good for getting on their horses and fighting and killing." He found Petrov Hull's name on the list and used the quill pen to outline a circle. Chapter 121, The Looting. Roland was finally relieved after interrogating the 5 families. When he leaned against the chair, Nightingale took the initiative to walk behind him and massage his shoulders. From defeating Duke Ryan to capturing the Lord's castle, they only took 1 day. It went much smoother than he had expected. When the Duke died in the battle, most of his people decided to surrender. The mercenaries, particularly, defected and kneeled to express their willingness to serve His Highness. Thus the mercenaries watched over the surrendered knights and nobles, while the First Army watched over the mercenaries. Together, they went east and arrived in Long Song's stronghold at 3 p.m. that day. Upon seeing the Duke Ryan's head and the groups of surrendered nobles, the guards immediately opened the city gates to welcome Prince Roland. Roland did not immediately summon all the nobles in the city to declare his ownership of the stronghold. Instead, he first went to Lord's Castle. The castle sat in the center of the stronghold at the highest point, like a city within a city. When they broke into the city, there was an outbreak of small-scale fighting. When Nightingale blew up the courtyard gate with explosives, some 20 guards who did not follow the Duke to the battlefield put up a struggle. They were shot dead by the First Army. But in their attack, they used hand crossbows and hurt 5 members of the army. Of those, 2 were seriously injured, but fortunately, Nana, who was with the troop, was there to cure them instantly. 10 guards tried to escape with the Duke's family through the back door, but Lightning, who was monitoring the situation from the sky, noticed them. They were captured at once, including the Duke's wife and his 2 sons. Until then, they were still in the dark about the Duke's defeat. After capturing the Lord's castle, the First Army took over its defense. Doubtlessly, Duke Ryan's castle was 3 or 4 times the size of the castle in Bordered Town. Its design was also much grander, with 6 lookout towers making up a hexagon outline. The central tower was almost 5-story high, an unusual feat at this point in history. The courtyard had everything, including houses, warehouses, and stables. There was even a private jail in the castle's basement. Roland put the valuable captives and the Duke's family in prison and evacuated the civilians. The weapons he had confiscated from the mercenaries were placed in an empty room in the courtyard in batches. In the meantime, he also selected several leaders and paid them handsomely, so they can take care of themselves. In his mind, North Slope Mine was the best home for those opportunists, but he had more important things to do. That was the most important thing to loot after a battle, commonly known as searching the dead bodies. Roland led the witches to ransack the entire castle. They even found the god's stones of retaliation in the vault and secret chamber. By the time they were done, their haul was breathtaking. In the basement alone, they had discovered 2 boxes of gold royals. Even with a conservative estimation, they gauged there were at least 10,000 gold royals there. In a secret compartment in the bedroom, Nightingale found several gemstones the size of eyeballs. Behind a fireplace, Echo found the door to a secret chamber stuffed with all kinds of gold handicrafts like scepters and crowns, but also dazzling jewelry, all neatly placed on a shelf. This was a duke's wealth. Looking at the massive wealth and considering the revenue of Border Town that was less than 500 gold royals in fall and winter, Roland became emotional. This was the temptation of looting and plundering. If Roland did not come from a highly industrial society, he would have been addicted to the feeling it gave him. Despite his profound emotions, these things still have to be taken in. There would be a boom in the working population of Bordered Town in the foreseeable future, so he needed a lot of money to import food before the development of their agriculture. After Hummingbird's magic was used to reduce the weight of the boxes of treasure, Iron Axe and the prince's guards escorted the transportation of the treasures back to their castle through the little town. Considering the time spent in enchanting bulky items, it took about 3 days to ship them all to their destination. That was also why Roland did not demand gold royals as ransom the next day. He had benefited a lot from the Duke. What he needed most were people and livestock. "Your Highness, are you really only staying here for a week?" Nightingale asked. "What's wrong?" Roland closed his eyes, enjoying the sensation of numbness on his shoulders. "This is the biggest town in the western region," she said softly, "and compared with Bordered Town, don't you want to stay at a more prosperous place? There are too many intricate power struggles in Longsong's stronghold. It's not suited for what I want to do. It's fine if we want to maintain the status quo, but once we want to make changes, we'll face more and more resistance. And I can't uproot those forces in one go right now." Roland smiled. "Of course, what's most important is that the church's teachings have been entrenched in the people here. They won't be able to accept you all so soon. But as I've said, I hope the witches can walk freely on the streets. I've succeeded in Bordered Town." "Yes," Nightingale said softly, "you fulfilled your promise." "Your Highness, I've made my selection." "Let me see." Roland took the list from him. As he had anticipated, most were second-class serfs. There were 800 of them, as well as 100 cattle and 300 sheep. In total, they were equal to 900 points. The rest were craftsmen. "Your Highness, is that fine?" "Of course, as long as we accumulate 3,000 points." Roland returned the list to Petrov. "When can you gather all these supplies and people?" "I can do it today, as per my arrangement with the property and people of Honeysuckle Domain. However, Your Highness, it may take half a month to ship them to Bordered Town." That'll be up to you, Roland said, knocking the desk. I take that you have experience in arranging caravans? Yes, Your Highness. Petrov hesitated before adding, what about my father? You can take him back today. The prince smiled and handed him a parchment scroll. If you don't have any questions, leave your signature and fingerprint on it. This is an agency contract? Petrov glanced at the top of the scroll, his voice shaking with excitement. Are you agreeing to grant the Honeysuckle family the right of agency? He unfolded the scroll and began reading it carefully. Roland nodded with satisfaction at Petrov's cautiousness. The most basic requirement to be his partner was having a keen eye on contracts. Petrov raised his head a moment later. The content is almost the same as what you told me yesterday. But, he pointed to the bottom of the scroll. Your Highness, shouldn't it be my father's name? He's the Earl of Honeysuckle and the representative of our family. Roland laughed. Of course not. The one I'm discussing becoming the agent of Longsong's stronghold with is you, not your father. Naturally, it's you who have to sign the contract. Petrov was stunned and asked in disbelief, Your Highness, do you mean you want me to? That's right. You'll replace the Duke and manage Longsong's stronghold for me. Roland nodded. If the contract is enforced smoothly, you'll continue to govern the city after I become the king. He paused, his smile gone. But if you violate the contract, you'll end up like the Duke. I've invaded this city once and I can do it again. So do well, Mr. Ambassador. Chapter 122, The Father and the Son. The dungeon of the castle was not as damp and dark as the prison in bordered town, for the Duke did not want his basement to become a haunted house, or a house where anyone could smell the disgusting odor once they walked downstairs. The dungeon was still clean in general. Different cells were decorated differently according to the standards. Some of them were totally empty while some of them not only came with a bed, but were even fully equipped with a closet, a desk, and chandeliers. It seemed that the Duke originally took this as a place to imprison some nobles, and he wanted to ensure that basic etiquette was still being observed. Roland also found a special cell in the corner, a room which was half occupied by a big bed. There was a chain hanging down from the ceiling, and the iron handcuffs on the chain were wrapped with a layer of sheepskin, and on the wall was hanging all kinds of whips. It seemed that Duke Ryan had an affluent knowledge in that special area. But unfortunately, Roland would leave here in a few days, and he had lost the chance to get close to that special area here. As the most valuable captive, Shalafi Hull was naturally arranged to live in the best cell. If you never noticed the iron railings which were outside the house, you may have thought it was a luxurious bedroom. The ones he lived with were the Viscounts from the Maple Leaf family and the Wolf family, the eldest son of the Wild Rose family, and the second son of the Elk family. Together with Lion Ryan, these families were called the Fortress Six. Of course, the Ryan family had been disintegrated by Roland, and his wife and sons were imprisoned next door. When His Highness appeared in the dungeons, all the nobles stood up. Roland said, Earl Hull, you can leave here. As for the other people, when the ransom arrives, I'll let you go. He added this before they could ask. Father, said Petrov, relieved at seeing the Duke's ruddy face. He glanced at his friend and then looked at Roland. Your Highness, I didn't see the name of the Earl of the Elk family on the list. If he's died on the battlefield, and the eldest son of his family is still in the king's city, then there's no man to support the whole family. Is it possible to release Renémad first and let him raise the ransom? I'm prepared to guarantee him. The eldest son of the Elk family, do you mean Jacquemart? Roland shook his head and said, he's already been back and came to the castle yesterday, but I don't think he intend to pay the ransom. Hearing this, René leaned against the cage. Why? He asked in disbelief. He said you didn't protect your father on the battlefield and you killed Elmad. Why did he say that? The killer is obviously... René suddenly sealed his lips. Roland just got over it and said, what you were trying to say was the killer is obviously me, right? He went to the cage and said, your father sent the people into my castle, and he wanted to burn the crops before the months of demons. Now he had invaded my domain with the Duke, and I just made a counterattack to also repel the invaders. So am I a killer? Compared with them, who should be condemned? If it were not because you were proved to know nothing about the whole thing, you were a dead man already." Renee could not say anything. "Your Highness," asked Petrov, "if no one is willing to pay the ransom, will you execute him?" "No, I won't. I'm always benevolent," Roland grinned and said, "and I'd probably send him back to Border Town and make him mine on Northern Slope for 20 years for atonement." "So, how much is the ransom?" he asked. As the second son, he has no chance to inherit the title of nobility, so the price is naturally less than that of the Earl of Honeysuckle. It only needs materials worth about 1,000 points. Roland looked at him with interest. "So, do you want to pay the ransom for him? What kind of materials? 1,000 pieces of gold royals?" The Earl, who was released by the guards, interrupted. "Your son will tell you about that." Prince Roland made a gesture of please. "Go, there's nothing here worth staying for. As for the second son of the Mud family, you don't have to rush for that. You can go back and think about it." When they left the dungeon and went to the gate of the castle, the Earl suddenly stopped. "Your Highness, I know that Duke Ryan may be guilty, but his wife and sons are innocent." "Yes, maybe," said Roland indisputably. "I didn't intend to punish them by exiling them or hanging them to death. I'll only bring them back to Border Town and imprison them." He wouldn't release them until the day that he ascended the throne. The situation would be more complicated if he became remissive now because the eldest son had a legal inheritance to the throne. "What?" Hull stared at Petrov unbelievably. "His Highness doesn't intend to live in Longsong Stronghold, but he let you manage the whole city?" As soon as they returned to the Honeysuckles, Petrov immediately told his father in detail what had happened in the 3 days. The Earl could not bear it when he heard about the contract, and when he got the specific answer, he stood up and walked around in the schoolroom again and again with mixed feelings. "Father, are you all right?" Petrov anxiously asked. "Now it seems our opponent is mainly the Elk family. There's a broad gap between us and the other 3 families in terms of both wealth and culture. Sorry." "What?" He did not get the idea of his father. "Opponents? The opponents?" The Earl yelled. "I'm so disappointed with you. His Highness gave you such a great chance, but you haven't yet analyzed who is your opponent. Don't you feel odd about that? Why does His Highness insist on going back to Border Town? It's really odd, but what does that have to do with us? We just need the real contract," the Earl said as he fondled his mustache. Petrov thought, and His Highness wouldn't use much energy just for a joke. "As to the reasons why he loves Border Town that much, I can slowly think about that again." But what he didn't expect was that his father accepted the fact so easily. "I heard that the Mud guy is your friend," Shalafi suddenly said firmly, "and you go to get him out tomorrow. Do you allow me to redeem him with materials worth 1,000 points? Petrov was stunned. "Well, think about it. If the Earl of the Elk family died, the eldest son wouldn't want to redeem the second son. So in this battle, the only sacrifice would be a few knights, and it seems that there's hardly any loss. Once Jacques Mad inherits the throne, it'll inevitably hinder you from being in charge of managing Longsong Stronghold," the Earl explained. "Why was Jacques reluctant to redeem Renee? Because he was afraid Renee will be a threat?" Petrov wondered while bitterly smiling. But he knew that his father was right. Renee liked swords and rifles since he was young, and he was very close to the knights in this domain. Unlike the eldest son Jacques, who thought that a royal should not be involved in fighting and preferred romantic things. Although Renee had repeatedly shown that he wanted to become a knight, but that was in the absence of inheritance to the throne. Now, without the control of the Earl, who knew whether he would gather the knights to kill the eldest son, Jacques would not spend money to redeem a person who made him felt restless. His decision was very simple and ruthless. "My friend will never do that," he firmly said. "Maybe, if you redeem him, no matter what he intends to do will be a headache for Jacques," Shalafi went on to say, As for the points, we can choose some wonderful craftsmen. When preparing for your ransom, I've transferred some craftsmen, and if we use more, I'm afraid there wouldn't be enough craftsmen in the whole domain. Don't worry, do you know that the northern region is a mess now? Earl said confidently. The four kingdoms were all destroyed in Hermes, the lords forced people to join the army, and there have been a large number of fugitives. We can take this opportunity to take a little more, and then we'll save the monthly supplies. Petrov found that his father was also a business master. At least he did much better in business than he was on the battlefield. Chapter 123, The Offer of the Church. On the fourth day after Roland had conquered Stronghold, he summoned all the nobles in and near the area to the hall of the castle. Although the majority had already known the news, he thought that he still had to make it clear before all of them. The western region had a new lord. When he said that he would go back to Border Town and had asked the eldest son of the Honeysuckle family to take charge in his stead, all the nobles started to argue immediately. Of course, nobody was willing to take the lead to dissent at that moment while the head of the Duke was still hanging high in the gate, and Timothy's defeat made speculators decide to seek for external help. After the knights of the Honeysuckle family were ransomed, the rest of the captured knights from other families could not be ransomed. Together with those mercenaries, they would be escorted to Border Town. In Roland's plan, all the mercenaries were sent to the mine for labor reforming, while the knights would be considered for employment based on their repentant attitude. After all, most knights were literate and could be the first teachers of universal education. They, of course, were forbidden to use weapons for the rest of their lives. As a result, the Honeysuckle family's power would be much greater than the other four families. They had enough armed forces to defend Long Song's stronghold and their own Earl territory, Roland thought. And as for small confrontations and their interests among those five families, they were Petrov's responsibility to worry about. During the past few days, Roland had taken some time to order his guards to capture some officials who were held accountable for causing residents of Border Town to starve and freeze to death 2 years ago. The treasurer, Reynolds, was included. They would receive a people's trial in Border Town. The only pity was that Earl Hirtimud, who attempted to burn Roland's army provisions and killed Greyhound, was dead on the battlefield without standing trial. Now, the traffic between Long Song's stronghold and Border Town had been fully restored. Each day over the coming 7 days, more than 10 sailing ships would carry material resources to Border Town. Roland guessed Baruch would be very busy in taking over coins looted from the Duke and resettling a large number of immigrants, and he wondered if Karl had built those temporary wooden sheds as he told him to. Thinking about it here, he could not wait to return to Border Town as quickly as possible to take charge of the forthcoming farming project. After accompanying the nobles to have lunch, the castle ushered in a special guest when Roland was about to take a nap. It was the high priest, Tylo, in the Long Song stronghold church. Suddenly, Roland's sleepiness was killed. Different from Border Town, the church had been rooted here for a long time. They not only built a church but also had a high priest stationed here. This was also the main reason why the prince made up his mind to return to Border Town to develop it. Long Song stronghold had been indoctrinated and influenced by the church for such a long time that any civilian could be their informer. And his public involvement plan would be constrained, and the risks of witches being exposed would be multiplied. Unless the church was uprooted, his reformation would be going nowhere. It was quite normal for the church to keep an eye on the changing of the Long Song stronghold's lord. But what made Roland feel strange was that they should wait till today to send a representative to make dealings with him. However, the representative's identity was not simple. Believers of high priests were senior figures in the church and responsible for supervising one area which was similar to the secular dukes. As usual, he met the representative in the hall. As a middle-aged man about in his 40s, High Priest Tylo, wearing a church-customized, white robe with a blue border, was very neat in his dress and appearances, and he behaved like a courteous noble. If Roland were not in favor of witches and the royal family, he would be glad to talk with such a person. The high priest must wear a high-quality god's stone of retaliation. In case of any accidents, Roland told Nightingale before the meeting to stay far away from the representative's location. After Tylo saluted, Roland invited him to be seated and ordered his attendants to serve tea. No matter what he was thinking, he must behave properly. "Your Highness, I send blessings on behalf of Holy City," Tylo said with a smile on his face. "You've already become the Lord of the Western region as entitled, and may God bless you." "Thanks," Roland answered in a relaxing tone, "and it seems that you don't care if I've killed Duke Ryan and seized Long Song's stronghold. We're rarely involved in those secular disputes. Whoever can provide the people a better life is a good king. Whether he's born to a particular family or from the royal family isn't the church's focus. In fact, promotion in the church never looks at believers' identities. I'm just a son of a farmer, but now the high priest." He smiled. "With all due respect, Your Highness, I'm afraid that sons of farmers can't become dukes, can they? If he launched an uprising and overthrew the royal family, he would be the king." Although Roland thought this, he did not retort and changed the topic directly. "So why are you here, just for sending blessings?" "Sending blessings is only part of it. I'm also here for cooperation." "Cooperation? Cooperation of what?" "We can provide whatever that can help you to expand your domain and influence." "Wait." Roland frowned. "You just said that the church was rarely involved with secular disputes." "Rarely involved doesn't equal non-involvement," the high priest calmly said. "Nowadays, the fight between your elder brother Timothy and Princess Garcia has led to a miserable life for the people in the Southern Territory. I've mentioned that the church considers whoever can lead the people to a peaceful life to be a respectable king. And you're exactly the kind of person." Roland was stunned and wondered if the high priest was implying that they wanted to help him fight for the throne. He asked subconsciously, "Why? You've led the people to fight against demonic beasts in Border Town and survived the months of demons, which proves your courage and ability. The amount of food you've bought from Willow Town shows that you don't want people to starve and suffer, which is a sign of kindness. The three noble qualities and the royal blood are the reasons why we choose you." Roland did not believe those reasons at all, but it at least showed that even though Border Town was covered by heavy snow and isolated from the outside, the church was still staring at this remote place. "But how? Dispatching the Judgment Army to fight for me? We want to quell the war as soon as possible, but it'll raise most of the nobles' resentment, so we can only help with the material resources." The high priest took 2 pills from his bosom, one red and one black. "This is from the Holy Prayer Room in Holy City, which is equivalent to your alchemic workshop. The red pill can make your men temporarily have formidable strength, and the black pill can multiply their pain, cold, and heat tolerances. With these drugs, your army will be unstoppable. And the church only charges the most basic production costs." He paused. "Each pill is worth 5 gold royals. I can give you the 2 pills for free as test samples to prove that what I said is true. What do you ask for in return?" "Expanding the scope of the congregation and establishing a church in every territory." "That's good, of course, but it's our intention to quell the war. As long as the people live a peaceful life, they'll naturally come into the arms of God." Roland took the pills. "It sounds fantastic, but for now, I don't want to compete to be the king of the Kingdom of Grey Castle. Besides, both Timothy and Garcia are my closest blood relatives and I don't want to hurt them." "I can understand." The high priest smiled. "But sometimes family affection doesn't stop the temptation of obtaining rights, especially when you become an obstacle to their rights. Pills are just the starting point, and we can provide a little more help. If you decide to go that way, you can come to look for me at the church anytime." At this, he stood up and bowed down. "I've brought the resolution of the church, and may God be with you, Your Highness." Chapter 124, Returning to the Town. When Tylo left, Nightingale revealed herself from the mist and said, "Today is probably the day that you've told the most lies." Roland said impatiently, "What can I do when the person was the high priest of the church? Anyway, can you tell if he was lying?" "No, The scene around him was engulfed by the god's stone of retaliation, and I could only see the darkness. Unfortunately, the high priest couldn't be treated like the noble, Roland thought with regret. He put the 2 pills on the table. Do you think the pills are really as amazing as what he said? For pain relief, morphine could do it. But in order to make the soldiers become powerful, it sounded like the effect of the adrenal hormone. The problem was how to extract these 2 substances to make pills. If the church owned such technology, they should have conquered the world. Wait. Roland suddenly thought of a possibility. Maybe it has something to do with the magic power? Can you see the flow of magic power? He looked at Nightingale and asked, is there magic power in these 2 pills? Nightingale observed carefully. I can't see the magic power, but it's a bit like the god's stone of retaliation. The god's stone of retaliation? Roland was stunned. She nodded. Well, you've seen the world through the mist. It's only black and white there, but the darkness is different from that formed by the god's stone of retaliation, the latter more like a void that swallows the world around it. I don't know how to describe that feeling. Nightingale hesitated. It's better to say there's nothing inside rather than a darkness inside of the whole. Nothingness. Yes, that's nothingness. She nodded. The 2 pills also have something like nothingness, but they are subtle, and they're also not a circular hole, but rather sections of the black flowing filaments. Does this nothingness affect your ability? Nightingale grabbed the pills, entered into the mist, but soon retreated. It seems to have no effect. It seems necessary to find a condemned prisoner to try these 2 pills and see what happens. Roland carefully wrapped the pills, and held the pills in his arms. I didn't expect the church to be so optimistic about you. Nightingale sat by the prince, and said depressingly. If the high priest didn't wear the god's stone of retaliation, I'd bet there are lies in 9 out of his 10 sentences. Roland curled his lips. The most important thing is what they do. What they ask for is totally different. Why? Think about what they want: more churches, more believers, a prince or king who's supported by himself, and deciding the propaganda of the divine right of kings, a stable country that's more conducive to their development of believers and development of power. Otherwise, under an annual war, the church and the cloister will become a target for robbery by refugees and aristocrats. What they like is that you can bring a stable life for the people. It's not the case. Roland shook his head. Stability comes from unity or balance. Even if the king eats and drinks every day, the people in the unified country live happier than the refugees in the war. So it's not surprising that they support the second prince, and it's not surprising that they support Princess Garcia. But it's so strange to come and support me, especially when Garcia is victorious. Now if the church fully supports Garcia, I'm afraid that the king's city and the east side of the area will be swallowed by her in no more than 6 months. If 70% of the land of the Kingdom of Greycastle belonged to Queen of Clearwater, Roland thought their pressure would also be greatly increased. If we don't help the strong one but choose the weakest one, it seems that this decision is beneficial to us. It can be assumed that we accept their support, and then the situation of Greycastle will become more chaotic. The direct impacts of the 3 countries are the sharp decline in the population, the rapid loss of wealth, the wars spread to the whole country, and the date of unification is dragged on. What benefits can the church gain? They won't have more believers. Worse still, I'm afraid all the churches will be demolished. I don't understand the idea of you nobles. You always beat around the bush. Nightingale sighed. Yeah, Roland replied with a smile. Except for me. The witch narrowed her eyes and stared at the prince for a long time. It's strange. Why does that sentence also appear to be true? 3 days later, Roland finally evacuated the castle and the library of Longsong Stronghold, contentedly taking the little town on the way home. While approaching Border Town along the Redwater River, the scenery on both sides of the river had changed. In the open space of the town opposite where Anna burned, many people were busy working. Judged by their appearance, they were the serfs who first arrived in the town. While close to the impassable mountain range, there were many simple wooden sheds that had been put up. Someone was moving in the wooden shed. Roland guessed it was a family member of the serfs. These people were bound to the land from generation to generation, and their children were born to be serfs. Most people were living a number life because they could not see hope. What drove them to work was not their inner desires, but the whip and cable set in the hands of the slaveholders. Low production efficiency was a great waste of human resources. There was no doubt that slavery was the enemy of industrial production and belonged to the system that needed to be abolished. Roland did not intend to let them all become free people easily, but to provide a channel so that they could see the hope that they could be promoted to be free people. There was a precedent to follow: slaves divorced from slavery because of the kindness of their lord. Even if the spread of this approach would not have had much impact, other aristocrats felt that they were just a good person at most. When the time was right, he would fully implement the abolition of the slavery law. The resistance would be much smaller then. The wharf was full of sailing ships, and it was clear that this small wharf had been unable to bear such heavy transport pressure. Fortunately, the draft of the little town was shallow, so it could dock directly without a wharf. It seems that the expansion of the wharf also needed to be listed on the schedule, Roland thought. When they returned to the castle, he could not take any rest. The moment he returned to the office, he called Baruch, letting him report on the situation of receiving the goods. And the assistant minister was also ready. He took a roll of parchment from his pocket, spreading it out on the big wooden table. "Your Highness, the things that you're taking back to the castle these days really scare me." Although he said so, his face overflowing with wrinkles betrayed his feelings. It took the 12 apprentices a whole night to count all the coins, and the total is more than 14,000 pieces of gold royals. "Your Highness, it's equivalent to a year's income in an ordinary town." Roland thought that it might take more than 20 years for a duke to save those many gold royals. And these gold royals were from the search, plunder, and exploitation of the people in the western region. He wanted to turn them into food, steel, and machinery as soon as possible. What about the gemstones, jewelry, and handicrafts? There isn't enough time to convert it all, but the conservative estimate is also about 10,000 gold royals. If they're sent to the king's city to auction, the price will be higher. Now they're stored in the basement of your castle. Baruch stopped a second. "But there aren't enough rooms to be used for food storage, so I suggest that you expand the castle and build more warehouses to store other materials." Chapter 125, The Municipal Construction of Border Town. "Where's the person who sent it? Any classification statistics?" Roland asked. "Yes, please refer to the bottom." Baruch pointed to the bottom of the scroll and said, "A total of 1,100 have been sent to Border Town. They are mainly farmers, and they were placed outside of the town as per your request. 35 of them were craftsmen that were placed under Karl's command. Their residences have been prepared in the new civilization district." Baruch clumsily pronounced the name. "However, is this okay, Your Highness? I remembered you were initially preparing it for the witches. The guards whom I sent to spread the rumors haven't returned yet, and the progress has been slower than I thought. Just let the craftsmen and their families have their houses, and we can always build more." The entire border town would need to eventually be refurbished in Roland's plan. The cottages built with the wood and mud shall be replaced with brick houses, and they shall leave room for a spacious street at the same time, unlike the current alley which only allowed 2 people to pass side by side. "Yes," Baruch nodded and said, "Your Highness, I heard that there would also be cattle and sheep being delivered." "Yeah, but not now. I specially asked them to deliver them a few days later along with the shepherds. There's a grassland between the misty forest and the impassable mountain range west of the city wall. It should be good for pasture. We need to blow out 2 openings in the city wall for the people to pass first. After all, it'll only be used during the months of demons." Now that Roland had both men and wealth, the development limitations of Border Town had temporarily disappeared. Roland could finally put the town to good use. He asked the bodyguard outside the door to come in and ordered, Go and get Carl from the administrative office. I guess you'll find him in the wooden shed area outside of town if he isn't in the mine." After an hour, Carl walked into the office, bowed and said, "Your Highness." It had been half a year since he met the member of the Mason Guild, and he could be considered as the busiest officer since he was hired to work in the City Hall of Border Town, managing the repair of the city wall, model houses, and those of the wooden shed temporary residential area. He was currently 35 years old with several white hairs showing on both of his sideburns. His skin was slightly tanned, but he looked a lot more energetic than when they first met. It was true that the environment could quickly change a person. 6 months ago he was a Mason Guild refugee who was carefully concealing his identity. Now he was an experienced project commander and managed the engineering projects all by himself. Now he possessed the stature and gestures of a superior. However, what Roland most admired was his willingness to give. Roland smiled and nodded. "Come and sit by the table." He handed the sketches he had just drawn to Carl and said, "Take a look. I'll need you to build these new things." This is the warehouse. The bottom part of it is built on stilts. That could effectively prevent moisture issues. Carl quickly finished scanning through the first sketch before he flipped to the second sketch and observed for quite a good while before asking, "This is a stove?" "Indeed, you'll need to build more than 5 furnaces on a border of North Slope Mountain to incinerate the cement and burn the clay bricks. We'll need an open space, and considering the transportation channels and the yard position, more furnaces will be needed after it has been expanding to a larger scale." "Yes." He turned to the last page of the sketch and frowned. "This looks like a drain?" "No, it has a roof and parapet on top. It looks like it has a pond behind it." "Your Highness, I don't understand." Roland smiled. "It's a lavatory and it'll be your highest priority." "Lavatory?" Carl contemplated for a while and said, "Your Highness, where are you planning to build it?" "There are commodes in your castle, and the attendant would handle them regularly." "As for the villagers, they normally wouldn't need this kind of thing, they would resolve directly outside of their houses. So do the farmers, they just need to release themselves into Redwater River and the river would take the filth away." Thus, he could smell the strong stinky smell when he came ashore today. Roland shook his head, intending to disperse the unpleasant memory. "Exactly, we need to change that bad habit." "Ah, bad habit?" Carl did not seem to quite understand. It's of course hard to understand for the people who are accustomed to defecating anywhere. How beautiful the world would be if a casual stroll wouldn't risk stepping on stools. Roland silently criticized in his heart. "Anyway, you just need to build it according to the sketch, and I've roughly marked the measurements. It should be located around the wooden shed area. There should be at least 4 to be built, and they should be built side by side on a 2x2 basis. Other than the ditch in the middle, it's to be built with bricks. The sheds, roofs, and partitions outside should be built with wood as it would save a lot of cement." "Your Highness, you're trying to gather them together to that." Carl paused as he obviously felt that he was degrading the dignity of the royal family by discussing such a filthy subject in front of His Highness. "What if they don't go in? I'll issue an order for them to follow. You can go ahead and organize staff for the implementation." "In that case, I'll follow your order." He nodded and said, "Your Highness, I have one more thing to report to you." "Go ahead." Since the Mason Guild was forced to dissolve, there were a lot of people, just like me, that chose to leave the King's City. I'm thinking of writing a few letters inviting the members of the Mason Guild of whom I know to Border Town. They all have their strength, such as Laisha, who's very good at the furnaces you mentioned. Your Highness, I'm not sure. There's no problem at all, Roland quickly said, and you invite all of them here and rebuild the Mason Guild. The pay shall be calculated according to what was paid at the Mason Guild, and the experienced ones can be inducted into City Hall. Thank you for your generosity. Carl bowed with gratitude. After the Mason left, he started to compose the serfs management and title removal system. The population of Border Town would soon reach a peak. If the town continued to depend on food importation, The town would be in danger if there was any sort of disaster or if they were cut off from business. Therefore, other than the industrial sector, the agriculture sector would need to be quickly developed as well in order to achieve food self-sufficiency as soon as possible. Prince Roland believed that as long as there was a promotion, the serfs would soon transform into active farmers. In addition to the improved seeds by leaf, the farmland beside Redwater River would soon turn into an ocean of golden wheat in summer. Regarding his request to prioritize the lavatory construction, that was to prepare for the agriculture development coordination. After having the men, land, and seeds, all that was needed was the fertilizers. Of course, Roland knew that using the fertilizer of humans and animals was very troublesome. It required regular cleaning of the storage pool and needed manual composting, which was not as convenient as a chemical fertilizer. However, he did not have a clue how to make chemical fertilizer, and so he could only substitute it with the natural organic fertilizer. At least the human and animal fertilizer was tested over a long period of time, and the traditional fertilization could still be seen in some rural areas in the 20th century. The people of this world knew very little about fertilizer, and most of them thought that feces was something filthy. Other than being used to disgust others, there was no actual use of it.